You've been resisting more than you realize, resisting the moment you're in, resisting the emotions that keep appearing, resisting the life unfolding right now. You tell yourself it shouldn't feel like this, that by now you should be calmer, more certain, more at peace. But if resistance were the answer, why does the same pain keep returning? Why does the mind feel exhausted from fighting? Why does peace always seem close yet unreachable? The truth is simple and ancient. What you stop resisting begins to teach you. Buddhist teachings have pointed to this for centuries, not through force or control, but through acceptance, through meeting reality exactly as it is. The Buddha taught that suffering doesn't come from pain alone. It comes from struggling against pain, from the mind saying no to the present moment, from clinging to what was and fearing what may come. When resistance ends, something quietly shifts. The mind softens, the heart opens, and insight begins to rise on its own. As you listen, your body may start to relax, your thoughts may slow down, and the inner tension you've been carrying can begin to dissolve. This isn't about giving up, and it isn't about becoming passive or weak. It's about seeing clearly and allowing life to reveal what it has been trying to show you all along. This isn't just something to hear, it's something to experience. What you stop resisting begins to teach you. Let's begin. Before we go deeper, something needs to shift. Not in your thinking, but in your attention. Up to now, you may have been listening with the same habit you use everywhere else, looking for relief, for answers, for something that will finally make discomfort stop. But what comes next only opens when that habit softens. What follows isn't meant to fix you or rescue you. It's meant to meet you exactly where you are. And if you let it, it will show you something you've been turning away from for a long time. Resistance is not random. It doesn't appear by accident. Every time you push something away, every time you tense up against a feeling, a memory, a situation, or a truth, something very specific is being highlighted. Resistance is like a spotlight you didn't know was there. It points directly to what matters most for your growth. But because it feels uncomfortable, the mind treats it like an enemy instead of a guide. Most people think resistance means something is wrong, something to escape, something to get rid of as quickly as possible. But in Buddhist understanding, resistance is more like an unopened letter. The discomfort is not the problem, the refusal to open it is. When you avoid what hurts, you don't avoid pain. You avoid the lesson that would have transformed the pain, and without that lesson, the pain finds another way back in. Look closely at what you resist. It's rarely neutral. You don't resist things that don't matter. You don't resist brushing your teeth or tying your shoes. Resistance appears around things that touch identity, fear, attachment, or loss. It shows up where the ego feels threatened, where control feels shaky, where certainty begins to crack. That's not a coincidence, that's precision. When an experience keeps repeating in your life, it's not because you're unlucky. It's because something in you refuses to learn what that experience is offering. Buddhism teaches that life doesn't punish, it repeats. Not out of cruelty, but out of intelligence. Like a teacher who patiently presents the same lesson again and again until the student is ready to see it. Avoidance feels like relief, but it's a delay. When you distract yourself, numb yourself, rationalize, blame, or spiritually bypass discomfort, the nervous system may calm for a moment, but the mind doesn't integrate anything. Wisdom doesn't land. The lesson stays unfinished. So life brings the same pattern back, slightly changed, often stronger, sometimes louder, until it can no longer be ignored. Resistance is often subtle. It doesn't always look like panic or anger. Sometimes it looks like procrastination, sometimes like humor, sometimes like constant self-improvement, sometimes like being busy. These are not neutral behaviors. They are strategies to avoid sitting with something that feels too exposed, too uncertain, or too raw. Buddhism doesn't judge this. It simply points it out. The mind resists because it believes resistance protects you. It thinks if it can control, suppress, or escape an experience, it can maintain safety. But this is an old survival pattern, not wisdom. It comes from fear, not insight. And fear cannot teach you what it's trying to hide. When you finally stop resisting, even slightly, something surprising happens. The experience doesn't get worse. It often becomes clearer. The emotional charge may still be there, but the confusion around it begins to dissolve. You start to see shape where there was only tension, meaning where there was only noise. In Buddhism, this is called turning toward instead of turning away. Not dramatizing, not analyzing endlessly, simply allowing the experience to be felt as it is, without commentary. This is where resistance transforms into instruction. The body relaxes enough to receive information. The mind quiets enough to understand. Every resisted experience carries a specific lesson because every form of resistance is connected to attachment. Attachment to control, attachment to self-image, attachment to certainty, attachment to comfort. When resistance appears, it's showing you exactly what you're clinging to. And clinging, not pain, is what creates suffering. For example, if you resist failure, the lesson is not about success. It's about identity. It's about who you think you are when things don't go your way. If you resist loneliness, the lesson is not about other people. It's about your relationship with yourself when no one is watching. If you resist uncertainty, the lesson is not about the future. It's about trust in the present. Avoidance delays wisdom because wisdom requires contact. You cannot learn the nature of fire by reading about it. You learn by feeling its heat, carefully, consciously. In the same way, emotional wisdom doesn't come from thinking your way out of pain. It comes from staying present long enough for the pain to speak. Pain has language, but resistance blocks your ability to hear it. When you tense against pain, you reduce sensitivity, you narrow perception, you go into defense. And defense is a closed position. Nothing enters, nothing teaches. This is why people say they've been through so much but still feel stuck. Experience alone doesn't mature you. Awareness does. You can live the same year 50 times and call it a lifetime. Or you can live one difficult moment fully and be changed by it. The difference is not strength, it's openness. Resistance also creates an internal split. One part of you feels something, another part rejects it. This fragmentation costs energy. It creates inner conflict. Buddhism calls this the second arrow. The first arrow is the pain itself. The second arrow is the resistance to it. And it's the second arrow that causes most of the suffering. When resistance drops, the second arrow disappears. The pain may still exist, but it's no longer multiplied by judgment, fear, or story. In that space, something else becomes possible. Understanding, acceptance, sometimes even compassion for yourself. Resistance often comes with a demand. This shouldn't be happening. But reality doesn't respond to demands. It responds to alignment. When you stop arguing with what is, your energy returns. You're no longer fighting the current. You're learning how to move with it. This doesn't mean liking what happens. Acceptance in Buddhism is not approval. It's honesty. It's acknowledging what is already here without trying to manipulate it into something else. From that honesty, clarity arises. And from clarity, wise action becomes possible. When you resist, you're blind. When you accept, you see, and seeing changes everything. The teacher you haven't met yet is not outside you. It's in the very experience you've been avoiding. The anxiety you try to silence, the grief you distract from, the anger you suppress. These are not obstacles on the path. They are the path when met correctly. Resistance keeps you stuck in reaction. Acceptance opens response. Reaction is automatic and unconscious. Response is spacious and aware. One repeats patterns, the other dissolves them. There's a reason the same triggers keep showing up. They are not there to torture you. They are there to teach you how you abandon yourself, how you tense, how you close, how you run. And once you see that clearly, the lesson completes itself. The pattern loses its grip. Wisdom doesn't come from comfort. It comes from intimacy with experience, not dramatic intimacy, quiet intimacy. The kind that listens without interrupting, the kind that allows discomfort to unfold without trying to rush it away. Avoidance feels active, but it's passive in the deepest sense. It leaves life unchanged. Acceptance feels passive, but it's profoundly active. It reorganizes the mind. It integrates experience. It ends repetition. When you stop resisting, you don't become weaker. You become more precise. You waste less energy. You stop fighting shadows. You meet what's real. And what's real always has something to teach. This is why Buddhist practice doesn't promise a life without pain. It promises a relationship with pain that transforms it, not by force, not by denial, but by understanding. And understanding only comes when resistance ends. What you've been avoiding is not your enemy. It's unfinished wisdom, waiting patiently until you're ready to stop running. Something has already shifted. By seeing resistance as a teacher instead of an enemy, the fight softened. What once felt like constant friction began to reveal meaning. But if resistance is the door, discomfort is what waits behind it. And this is where many people stop again, not because they don't want truth, but because discomfort feels confusing, unsettling, and personal. Yet discomfort is not random noise. It is organized. It carries intelligence. And once resistance loosens, discomfort becomes the next thing asking to be understood. There is a quiet moment when discomfort appears, a tightening in the chest, a restlessness in the body, a subtle sense that something isn't sitting right. Most people rush past this moment. They scroll, distract, analyze, or judge, but hidden inside that unease is a signal, not a punishment, not a mistake, a signal. Discomfort is not a flaw in reality. It is reality communicating with precision. The mind has been taught to treat discomfort as a problem to eliminate, something to fix as quickly as possible. But Buddhism points in a very different direction. It teaches that discomfort is a form of information, and like all information, it only becomes useful when it is received clearly. Discomfort arises when something inside you is out of alignment. Not morally wrong, not broken, simply out of alignment with truth, impermanence, or reality as it is. This misalignment creates friction, and friction creates sensation. That sensation is discomfort. The body often understands this before the mind does. A tight jaw during a conversation you're pretending to be okay with. A heavy feeling when you agree to something you don't mean. A restless energy when you're avoiding a truth you already know. These are not inconveniences, they are instructions. Discomfort shows you where awareness needs to go. In Buddhist practice, unease is treated with curiosity, not urgency. The question is not, how do I make this stop? The question becomes, what is this asking me to notice? This single shift changes everything, because once discomfort is listened to, it stops needing to shout. Most people assume growth should feel inspiring or uplifting, but real inner growth often feels awkward first. Discomfort appears when an old structure is no longer sufficient. When a belief has expired, when an identity is cracking. The mind doesn't like this. It prefers stability, even if that stability is limiting. Discomfort signals that stability is no longer true. This is why growth feels uncomfortable before it feels freeing. Discomfort is also precise. It doesn't appear randomly. It shows up in specific situations, with specific people, around specific themes: power, control, belonging, worth, loss, change. Each form of discomfort points to a different area of inner development. Anxiety may point to unresolved uncertainty. Guilt may point to misaligned values. Boredom may point to suppressed vitality. Sadness may point to something that needs to be honored, not avoided. When discomfort is ignored, the signal doesn't disappear. It intensifies or shifts form. What begins as mild unease can become chronic stress. What starts as restlessness can become burnout. What starts as quiet sadness can become numbness. This is not punishment. It is escalation due to non-response. Discomfort grows louder when it is unheard. The intelligence inside discomfort is not emotional drama. It is functional. It shows you where awareness has gone absent, where truth is being bypassed, where habit has replaced presence. When you stay with discomfort without trying to fix it, you begin to see patterns. You notice when it arises, what thoughts follow, what stories appear, what reactions want to take over. This observation alone creates space. In that space, discomfort changes character. It becomes less threatening, more informative, less overwhelming, more directional. Buddhism teaches that suffering arises not because discomfort exists, but because it is misunderstood. The mind assumes discomfort means something has gone wrong, so it reacts with fear or control. But discomfort is often the mind and body working correctly, alerting you to something important. Consider emotional discomfort during honesty. Speaking truth often feels uncomfortable at first, not because truth is harmful, but because the nervous system has learned to associate honesty with risk. Discomfort signals a boundary being reclaimed, a pattern being interrupted, growth happening in real time. Discomfort also appears when something old is falling away. Grief is discomfort with depth, not because something bad is happening in the present, but because attachment is being restructured. The pain is not meaningless. It is the nervous system learning to release what it once depended on. That process is intelligent, even when it hurts. There is also discomfort that arises from stagnation, a dullness, a sense of being disconnected. This is not peace. It is a quiet alarm, a signal that life energy is being suppressed, that curiosity has been abandoned, that safety has become a cage. Discomfort here points toward re-engagement, not escape. One of the most misunderstood aspects of discomfort is that it doesn't always tell you what to do. Sometimes it tells you what to stop doing, stop forcing, stop pretending, stop abandoning yourself, stop living on autopilot. The instruction is subtraction, not addition. Discomfort becomes unbearable only when it is resisted or interpreted incorrectly. When met with openness, it often reveals itself as temporary, fluid, and workable. The sensation moves, the intensity shifts, the fear around it dissolves. What remains is clarity. This clarity is not intellectual, it is felt understanding, a sense of, oh, this is what's happening. And that understanding changes how you respond, not because you decided to change, but because the signal was finally decoded. Discomfort also trains sensitivity. When you stop numbing or overriding it, you become more attuned to subtle inner cues. You catch misalignment earlier. You notice fatigue before burnout. You notice resentment before it hardens. You notice fear before it controls decisions. This sensitivity is wisdom in action. The mind often wants certainty. Discomfort often arrives with uncertainty. This is intentional. Growth requires tolerance for not knowing. Discomfort stretches that tolerance. It teaches you to stay present without immediate answers, to remain open without resolution. This builds trust in awareness itself. Buddhism does not promise comfort. It promises clarity. And clarity sometimes comes wrapped in discomfort, not to hurt you, but to wake you up. When discomfort is allowed, it completes its cycle. It delivers its message and leaves. When it is suppressed, it lingers, not because it wants attention, but because its function has not been fulfilled. Discomfort is not asking for obsession, it is asking for presence. This is why practices like mindfulness focus on sensation, not to dwell in pain, but to read it accurately. Sensation is the first language of experience. Thought comes later. When you learn to stay with sensation without interpretation, discomfort loses its threat and reveals its structure. There is intelligence in how discomfort arises and fades. It has timing. It has rhythm. It responds to attention. When you stop fighting it, it reorganizes naturally, often without effort. Discomfort also humbles the ego. It reminds you that control is limited, that life moves, that holding on creates strain. This humility is not weakness, it is realism, and realism is the foundation of peace. The most important shift is this: discomfort is not something happening to you, it is something happening for awareness. It is part of the learning system of being human. A feedback mechanism built into experience itself. When this is understood, discomfort is no longer feared. It becomes respected, not enjoyed, not sought out, but listened to. And once discomfort is listened to, it no longer needs to dominate. It has done its job. What once felt like an enemy becomes guidance. What once felt like noise becomes direction. What once felt like suffering becomes understanding. Discomfort was never the problem. Misreading it was. And as this understanding settles, something else becomes visible. A deeper layer beneath discomfort itself, a place where suffering is not about sensation, but about meaning, and that is where the next teaching waits. Something becomes clear after listening to discomfort instead of running from it. The unease no longer feels chaotic. Patterns begin to form. You start to notice that certain hardships don't just appear once and disappear. They return. They shape you. They stay long enough to change how you see yourself and the world. And this is where a deeper misunderstanding often lives. Many people believe suffering is proof that life is unfair or that they are being punished. But what if suffering is not random at all? What if it is structured? What if it is teaching you step by step? Suffering is usually treated as an error, something that went wrong, something that should not exist. But Buddhism offers a radically different view. It sees suffering as part of a learning process, not a moral judgment, not a cosmic mistake, not bad luck. Suffering is the curriculum of being human, and like any curriculum, it follows causes and conditions. Nothing you experience comes out of nowhere. Every hardship arises because of conditions that came together over time. Habits, choices, beliefs, attachments, expectations. Even things you didn't consciously choose still arise within a web of causes. This doesn't mean blame, it means understanding, and understanding changes everything. Karma is often misunderstood as fate, as if your suffering is predetermined or deserved. But in Buddhism, karma is feedback. It simply means action and result. Not punishment, not reward, feedback. When you touch a flame, your hand burns. Not because the flame is angry, but because heat has a natural effect. Suffering works the same way. It reveals how actions, reactions, and attachments produce results. This reframing is powerful, because once suffering is seen as feedback, it stops feeling personal. It stops being an attack on your worth. It becomes information about how life works. And information can be learned from. Suffering shows you where reality and expectation collide, where you demand permanence from what changes, where you expect control over what moves freely, where you cling to comfort in a world defined by impermanence. Each form of suffering corresponds to a specific misunderstanding. Loss teaches impermanence. Frustration teaches limits of control. Disappointment teaches attachment to outcomes. Anxiety teaches fear of uncertainty. These are not abstract ideas. They are lived lessons. When suffering is resisted, it feels meaningless. When it is understood, it becomes purposeful. Not pleasant, but purposeful. It sharpens awareness. It strips illusions. It reveals what actually matters when everything else falls away. Think of how hardship reorganizes priorities. When life is easy, attention scatters. When suffering arrives, focus narrows. You see clearly what cannot be taken from you and what was never solid to begin with. This clarity is not accidental, it is part of the curriculum. Suffering also slows you down. It interrupts momentum, it forces reflection, it brings the unconscious to the surface. Painful experiences often reveal patterns you were too busy to notice. How you react under pressure, how you treat yourself when things fall apart, where you seek safety, where you abandon yourself. These insights rarely come from comfort. The mind often asks, "Why is this happening to me?" But this question assumes punishment. Buddhism replaces it with a more useful inquiry. What is this showing me? The first question leads to bitterness. The second leads to insight. Suffering repeats when lessons are incomplete, not because life is cruel, but because understanding hasn't yet landed. This is why similar hardships appear in different forms. Different relationships, same emotional pain, different jobs, same burnout, different stages of life, same fear. The outer details change, but the inner lesson remains the same until it is learned. Learning does not mean liking the lesson. It means integrating it. When a lesson integrates, the suffering no longer needs to return. Not because you mastered life, but because awareness changed the conditions that created it. Suffering also exposes false narratives. The story that you must always be strong, the belief that you should have everything figured out, the idea that vulnerability is weakness. Hardship dismantles these ideas because they cannot survive reality. This dismantling hurts, but it also frees. In Buddhism, suffering is not something to transcend quickly. It is something to understand deeply. Rushing past it misses the point. Spiritual bypassing turns suffering into another avoidance strategy. True practice stays with suffering long enough to hear what it teaches without drowning in it. There is a balance here. You don't obsess over suffering. You don't dramatize it. You meet it with attention. You observe its causes. You notice how the mind reacts. You see how attachment tightens or loosens. Over time, suffering reveals its structure, and once structure is seen, it loses its mystery. Suffering also builds compassion, not as an idea, but as a lived capacity. When you know pain intimately, you stop judging others so quickly. You recognize struggle beneath behavior. This doesn't excuse harm, but it deepens understanding. Compassion becomes grounded, not sentimental. The curriculum of suffering also teaches humility. It shows that intelligence, effort, and good intentions do not grant immunity from pain. This humility softens arrogance and opens connection. It reminds you that being human means being affected. One of the most important teachings hidden in suffering is this: you are not separate from conditions. You are part of a larger flow. When you fight this, suffering intensifies. When you understand it, resistance relaxes. You stop demanding that life conform to your preferences. You begin to cooperate with reality instead of opposing it. This cooperation does not mean passivity. It means skillful response. When feedback is understood, behavior adjusts naturally. You make different choices. You set clearer boundaries. You let go sooner. Not because you forced yourself to change, but because insight made old patterns unnecessary. Suffering also teaches patience, not passive waiting, but the patience of staying present through discomfort without demanding immediate resolution. This patience builds inner stability. You learn that you can survive uncertainty, that emotions rise and fall, that no state lasts forever. Another layer of suffering's curriculum is teaching discernment. You begin to see which pains are unavoidable and which are self-created. Physical pain, loss, aging, and death are unavoidable. Resentment, rumination, and self-judgment are optional. This distinction is liberating. When suffering is framed as punishment, it creates shame. Shame closes the mind. When suffering is framed as curriculum, it creates curiosity. Curiosity opens the mind. This shift alone reduces suffering's intensity. Life does not teach gently all the time. Some lessons are subtle, others are forceful. The intensity often matches the depth of attachment involved. The more tightly something is held, the more painful its loss. This is not cruelty, it is physics of attachment. Over time, you may notice that suffering arrives right before growth, before clarity, before change. It destabilizes what is no longer true. It prepares the ground for something new. This doesn't mean you should seek suffering, it means you don't waste it. Suffering also removes illusions of control. This is one of its most difficult lessons. The ego wants guarantees. Suffering shows there are none. And strangely, this realization brings relief. You stop carrying a burden that was never yours to begin with. When suffering is seen clearly, it stops being an enemy. It becomes a teacher with a difficult voice but honest intentions. You don't need to thank it. You don't need to romanticize it. You only need to learn. And once the lesson is learned, suffering changes its role. It no longer dominates. It becomes a background signal rather than a central identity. You are no longer defined by what hurt you. You are shaped by what you understood. This is the heart of Buddhist wisdom. Life is not testing you to see if you're worthy. It is teaching you how to see. And suffering is one of its most effective instructors. As this understanding settles, another subtle confusion begins to dissolve. The belief that acceptance means giving up. The fear that allowing reality means stagnation. That is the next misunderstanding to be met, and it opens the door to a deeper clarity about what acceptance truly is. As suffering starts to make sense, a quiet fear often rises beneath the understanding. If hardship is a teacher, if discomfort carries intelligence, if pain is feedback and not punishment, then a new question appears. If I accept all of this, do I stop moving forward? Do I become passive? Do I just sit with everything and let life happen to me? This fear is natural, and it comes from a deep misunderstanding of what acceptance actually means. Acceptance has been confused with giving up, with resignation, with emotional numbness, with staying in situations that harm you. But this confusion exists because acceptance has been taught through the lens of helplessness instead of clarity. Buddhism never taught acceptance as weakness. It taught acceptance as the end of self-deception. And when self-deception ends, action becomes cleaner, wiser, and more effective. Emotional passivity is when you shut down, when you disconnect, when you stop caring because caring feels dangerous. Acceptance is the opposite of that. Acceptance is when you allow yourself to see clearly what is happening inside and outside without trying to distort it to feel safer. And seeing clearly is the foundation of intelligent action. When you don't accept reality, your actions are reactive. They come from fear, anger, or denial. You try to fix symptoms instead of causes. You push, force, and manipulate. This creates exhaustion, not change. Acceptance removes the fog that drives this kind of behavior. Think about what happens when you are emotionally passive. You suppress feelings, you avoid decisions, you tolerate situations you secretly resent. You tell yourself you are being spiritual or patient, but inside there is stagnation. Energy collapses inward, life feels heavy, nothing moves. This is not acceptance. This is avoidance wearing a calm mask. True acceptance is alive. It is alert. It is deeply engaged with reality. When you accept a situation, you are no longer arguing with it. And when the argument stops, energy becomes available. That energy doesn't disappear. It turns into clarity. Clarity leads to action that fits reality instead of fighting it. In Buddhism, acceptance begins with acknowledging what is already true, not what should be true, not what you hope will be true, what is actually happening right now. This includes emotions, circumstances, limitations, and conditions. When these are fully acknowledged, the mind stops wasting effort resisting facts. That effort turns into responsiveness. For example, accepting that you are tired doesn't mean you stay exhausted forever. It means you stop pretending you're not tired. And from that honesty, rest becomes possible. Boundaries become possible. Change becomes possible. Denial would have kept you stuck. Acceptance also removes emotional distortion. When you resist a feeling, it becomes exaggerated. When you accept it, it becomes clearer and often smaller. Anger that is acknowledged turns into information about violated boundaries. Fear that is accepted turns into information about perceived risk. Sadness that is allowed turns into information about loss and attachment. These emotions don't paralyze when they are understood, they guide. Passivity avoids responsibility. Acceptance embraces responsibility without blame. You stop blaming yourself or others for what is happening, and instead you take responsibility for how you relate to it. This is a subtle but powerful shift. Responsibility here doesn't mean control. It means responsibility, the ability to respond appropriately. One of the strongest illusions is that resistance equals strength, that pushing harder will create change. But resistance often blinds you. It narrows attention. It creates tunnel vision. Acceptance widens perception. You see more options. You notice what actually works instead of what feels emotionally satisfying. Acceptance also brings timing into focus. When you resist, you act too early or too late. You rush decisions out of fear or avoid them out of discomfort. When you accept, timing becomes intuitive. You act when conditions are right. You wait when waiting is wise. This is not passivity, this is precision. There is also a misunderstanding that acceptance means tolerating harm. Buddhism does not teach staying in abusive situations or ignoring injustice. Acceptance means seeing harm clearly without denial, and seeing harm clearly is what allows skillful action. You leave, you speak, you protect, you change conditions. But you do so without hatred clouding judgment. Hatred feels active, but it often leads to self-destruction. Acceptance removes hatred from action, not action itself. This makes responses stronger, not weaker. Acceptance is also deeply connected to self-trust. When you stop fighting reality, you start trusting your ability to meet it. You learn that you can feel discomfort without collapsing. You can face truth without being destroyed. This confidence creates courage. Courage leads to meaningful action. Emotional passivity numbs sensation. Acceptance sharpens sensation. You feel more, not less. But you are no longer overwhelmed because you are not fighting what you feel. You are listening. This listening allows emotions to complete themselves instead of getting stuck. Another important distinction is between surrender and stagnation. Stagnation is when nothing changes because nothing is examined. Surrender is when resistance drops and truth is examined fully. From surrender, movement arises naturally. You don't force growth. You allow it. Acceptance also dismantles false urgency. When the mind believes something must change immediately or everything will fall apart, it panics. This panic drives poor decisions. Acceptance calms urgency by grounding you in what is actually happening. From this calm, action becomes thoughtful and effective. There is also an emotional maturity that develops through acceptance. You stop demanding that life meet your expectations before you engage with it. You engage as it is. This maturity creates resilience. You bounce back faster, you adapt, you learn. Acceptance teaches you when effort is needed and when it is not. Some situations require action, others require patience. Resistance treats everything as a threat. Acceptance discerns differences. This discernment saves energy and prevents burnout. Many people fear acceptance because they associate it with losing desire, but acceptance doesn't remove desire, it removes desperation. You still want growth, connection, meaning, but you no longer chase them from lack. You move toward them from clarity. When acceptance is present, motivation changes. It no longer comes from fear of not being enough. It comes from alignment with values. This motivation is sustainable. It doesn't collapse under pressure. Acceptance also ends inner violence. When you constantly tell yourself you should be different, better, calmer, further ahead, you create an internal battlefield. Acceptance ends this war, and when the war ends, you have the strength to act. One of the clearest signs of true acceptance is flexibility. You are not rigid. You adjust. You respond. You learn. Emotional passivity is rigid. It shuts down. It says this is just how it is, without inquiry. Acceptance says this is how it is right now. Let's see what this allows. Acceptance also reconnects you to intuition. When the mind stops arguing, subtle signals become noticeable. You sense when to speak and when to stay quiet, when to move and when to pause. This guidance is not mystical, it's the result of clarity. Another key difference is that acceptance does not mean the absence of discomfort. It means the absence of resistance to discomfort. Discomfort may still arise, but it no longer dictates behavior. You can feel uncomfortable and still act wisely. This is why acceptance generates action. Not frantic action, not forced action, but action that fits the moment. Action that addresses root causes instead of symptoms. Action that respects limits and possibilities. Acceptance also builds emotional endurance. You stop avoiding difficult conversations, difficult decisions, and difficult truths. Not because they become easy, but because you trust yourself to handle them. This trust is empowering. When acceptance is misunderstood, people fear it will make them complacent. In reality, it removes complacency by exposing truth. You can't change what you refuse to see. Acceptance is seeing. Once you see clearly, change often happens naturally. You don't need to push yourself endlessly. You respond to what's obvious. You stop doing what harms you. You start doing what supports you. This is not passivity. This is alignment. Acceptance also frees you from emotional blackmail, both internal and external. You stop being controlled by fear, guilt, or obligation. You choose actions based on wisdom rather than pressure. This creates integrity. When acceptance becomes embodied, life feels simpler, not easier, but simpler. Fewer inner arguments, fewer wasted battles, more direct engagement with what matters. And as acceptance deepens, another layer of insight emerges. You begin to notice that resistance itself has a seductive pull. That the ego doesn't just resist by accident, it resists because resistance reinforces identity. This realization opens the door to the next teaching, where the deeper mechanics of resistance begin to reveal themselves. As acceptance becomes clearer, another realization quietly surfaces. Even when you understand acceptance, even when you see its power, something inside still resists. Not always loudly, sometimes subtly. A tightening, a preference, a silent refusal. This isn't a mistake, it points to something deeper. Resistance isn't just a habit, it serves a function, and the one it serves most faithfully is the ego. The ego doesn't resist reality because it hates peace. It resists because resistance keeps it alive. The ego is not a thing, it's a process. A pattern of identification built around control, separation, and continuity. It needs a stable me to exist. Resistance helps create that stability. Every time you push against reality, you reinforce the sense of a solid self, standing apart from what is happening. There is me here and that out there. This division feels real, and the ego depends on it. When you resist, you affirm identity. You say, even without words, this shouldn't be happening to me. That sentence contains an entire worldview, a fixed me, expectations, entitlement, continuity. Resistance becomes a way to defend the story of who you think you are. Acceptance threatens this story. If you fully accept what is, the boundary between me and experience softens. The ego feels this as danger. Not because acceptance is harmful, but because it dissolves the illusion of control the ego relies on. Resistance gives the ego something to do, something to fight, something to manage. When life is fully accepted, the ego loses its job. And it doesn't go quietly. Control is one of the ego's favorite tools. Resistance creates the feeling of control even when none exists. Struggling against reality gives the impression of agency. At least I'm not giving in. But this is not real control. It's symbolic control, a posture, a stance. And the ego feeds on this posture. The ego also resists because resistance maintains identity through conflict. Without resistance, many identities collapse. The victim identity, the rebel identity, the fixer identity, the superior identity. These roles require opposition. They need something to push against. Acceptance removes the opponent, and with it, the role. This is why letting go can feel disorienting. It's not just habits dissolving, it's identity dissolving. The ego senses this and tightens its grip. It creates reasons to resist, stories, justifications, moral arguments, anything to keep the sense of self intact. Resistance also reinforces the illusion of permanence. When you resist change, you act as if things should stay the same. This supports the ego's deepest fear, impermanence. The ego depends on continuity, a stable self, a predictable world. Resistance is a way to deny change even as it happens. But reality is impermanent by nature. Everything moves, everything shifts. When the ego resists this truth, suffering increases. Not because change is painful, but because denial creates friction. The ego doesn't mind pain as much as it minds uncertainty. Pain can be integrated into identity. This is my struggle. Uncertainty cannot. Acceptance introduces uncertainty. It opens space. It removes guarantees. The ego interprets this as threat. Resistance also strengthens the sense of authorship. I am the one who decides. I am the one who controls. But much of life unfolds beyond personal control. Acceptance reveals this. Resistance hides it. The ego prefers illusion over humility. Another reason resistance is addictive is because it gives emotional intensity. Anger, frustration, righteousness. These emotions feel energizing. They create momentum. The ego mistakes this energy for power, but it's reactive energy. It burns quickly and leaves exhaustion. Acceptance feels quieter, less dramatic. This quiet can feel like emptiness to the ego. Without drama, without struggle, without tension, the ego feels unseen, unneeded. So it creates new reasons to resist. Resistance also allows the ego to avoid vulnerability. Acceptance requires openness. It requires allowing experience to touch you fully. Resistance creates armor. That armor feels safe, but it blocks connection. The ego prefers safety to truth. Notice how resistance often appears just before surrender, just before insight, just before peace. This is not coincidence. The ego senses dissolution approaching and responds with urgency. Doubt, fear, distraction, anything to pull you back into identification. The ego also uses resistance to reinforce moral superiority. I shouldn't have to accept this. This is wrong. Sometimes this is true at a practical level, but internally the resistance often masks a deeper need to be right, to stand above reality instead of within it. Acceptance removes this hierarchy. It doesn't say everything is okay, it says everything is happening. From that clarity, ethical action can arise without ego reinforcement. Resistance also strengthens the illusion of a separate self over time. Each resisted moment is stored as memory. Memory becomes narrative. Narrative becomes identity. This is who I am because of what I've been through. Acceptance loosens the grip of narrative. The ego resists that loosening. The addiction to resistance is subtle because it masquerades as self-protection. The ego says it's keeping you safe. But what it's really protecting is its own continuity. It confuses identity with survival. Buddhism does not ask you to kill the ego, it asks you to see it clearly. When seen clearly, the ego loses its authority. Resistance becomes optional instead of automatic. When you begin to notice resistance without acting on it, something interesting happens. The urge weakens, not because you forced it to stop, but because it no longer serves its purpose. Awareness exposes the addiction. You start to see how often resistance arises unnecessarily, how much energy it consumes, how little it actually solves. This seeing is not judgment, it's insight, and insight dissolves compulsion. Acceptance feels threatening only when identity is rigid. As identity softens, acceptance feels relieving. You no longer have to defend an image. You no longer have to maintain control. You can respond instead of react. This doesn't mean the ego disappears. It becomes functional rather than dominant. It serves practical needs instead of dictating reality. Resistance loses its addictive pull. The illusion of permanence also begins to crack. You see that change doesn't erase you. It reshapes experience. You survive uncertainty. You survive letting go. This realization weakens the ego's grip more than any effort could. Resistance thrives on unconsciousness. Acceptance thrives on awareness. When awareness increases, resistance has nowhere to hide. It becomes transparent, and transparent things lose power. As resistance loosens, something else becomes possible. Pain itself begins to change. Not because pain disappears, but because it is no longer filtered through ego defense. This marks another turning point. Pain stops being an enemy and starts becoming instruction in a more direct way. And that shift leads to the next teaching, where pain itself reveals a different role when met without resistance. As resistance loosens and the ego's grip weakens, pain no longer arrives the same way. It still appears, but something fundamental has changed. The tension around it softens. The urgency to escape fades. What once felt like an emergency begins to feel like a signal. This is a quiet turning point, and many miss it because they're still waiting for pain to disappear. But something far more important happens instead. Pain begins to speak. Pain hurts most when it is negotiated with. When the mind bargains, argues, pleads, or demands that pain be different, the nervous system tightens. This tightening amplifies sensation. It adds layers of fear, resistance, and story. But when pain is met with awareness instead of negotiation, the structure of the experience changes from the inside. Awareness does not mean watching pain from a distance. It means allowing pain to be fully present without trying to manage it. No contracts, no timelines, no conditions, just honest contact. And honest contact transforms pain's role. The first thing that changes is intensity. Pain may still be strong, but it becomes cleaner. There is less emotional noise around it. Fewer thoughts saying, "This shouldn't be happening," or "I can't handle this." Those thoughts were never neutral. They were adding pressure. When they fall away, pain becomes more direct and less overwhelming. Pain instructs through sensation, through texture, through movement. When awareness stays with sensation, instead of fleeing into thought, you begin to notice that pain is not static. It pulses, it shifts, it rises and falls. This impermanence is not philosophical, it is directly felt. And once you feel impermanence, fear loosens its grip. Negotiation assumes pain has authority over you. Awareness reveals that pain is an experience, not an identity. You are not pain. You are aware of pain. This distinction is subtle but life-changing. It restores agency without control. You don't dominate pain. You don't submit to it. You relate to it. When pain is negotiated with, the mind keeps asking, "How long will this last?" Awareness removes that question, not because there is an answer, but because the question itself creates suffering. Staying with what is happening now removes the need to predict the future. Pain also becomes instructive because it exposes conditioning. You see how quickly the mind reaches for distraction, how fast it creates stories, how it judges sensation as good or bad. These reactions are not wrong, they are learned, and awareness reveals learning. Pain teaches you how you relate to discomfort in general. Do you tighten? Do you collapse? Do you fight? Do you dissociate? These responses appear automatically. Awareness slows them down. In that slowing, choice appears. When pain is met with awareness, it often reveals emotional layers beneath physical sensation. Fear, grief, anger, loneliness. These emotions were always there, but pain brings them to the surface. Negotiation tries to suppress them. Awareness allows them to be felt without interpretation. This feeling completes emotional cycles that were previously stuck. Pain also teaches boundaries. It shows where you have gone beyond capacity, where you ignored signals, where you pushed instead of listened. This is not punishment, it is correction. The body speaks honestly when words were ignored. Another shift occurs in time perception. Negotiated pain feels endless. Aware pain exists moment by moment. You deal with what is happening now, not what might happen later. This makes pain workable. Not easy, but workable. Pain met with awareness also deepens compassion, not as a concept, but as recognition. You see how universal pain is, how fragile humans are, how much effort goes into avoiding discomfort. This recognition softens judgment, both toward yourself and others. There is also a surprising increase in stability. When you stop negotiating, you stop exhausting yourself. Energy that was used to resist becomes available to hold experience. This holding is not gripping, it is spacious, and spaciousness reduces suffering. Pain instructs you about attachment. What you cling to becomes visible through what hurts. Loss hurts where attachment was strong. Awareness allows you to feel attachment without shame, and feeling attachment is the beginning of releasing it. Another lesson pain teaches is trust. Not blind trust, but trust in awareness itself. You learn that you can stay present with difficult experience without being destroyed. This trust builds confidence that no affirmation ever could. When pain is met directly, it often loses its need to dominate attention. It becomes one experience among many. Sensations, sounds, breath, space. Pain is no longer the whole field. Awareness widens naturally. Negotiation narrows attention. Awareness expands it. Pain also becomes less personal. Instead of "why is this happening to me?" there is simply "this is happening." This depersonalization is not cold. It is relieving. It removes unnecessary self-reference. Pain met with awareness also teaches patience, not forced patience, but organic patience. You stop rushing toward relief. You allow relief to come or not come. This allowance paradoxically creates conditions for relief. Another internal change is humility. Awareness shows that pain does not respond to force. It responds to understanding. This humility dissolves arrogance and self-blame alike. Pain also teaches you where control ends and cooperation begins. You cannot command pain away, but you can cooperate with experience. This cooperation reduces suffering even when pain remains. There is also an increase in sensitivity. Awareness sharpens perception. You notice subtle shifts, early signals, fine-grained sensations. This sensitivity allows earlier response in the future, preventing escalation. Pain instructs through contrast. You appreciate ease more deeply. You value simplicity. You recognize the fragility of comfort. This appreciation is not clinging. It is clarity. When pain stops hurting in the old way, it does not become pleasant. It becomes meaningful. And meaning changes relationship. You stop seeing pain as an interruption. You see it as part of life's intelligence. Pain also reveals the difference between endurance and presence. Endurance is rigid. Presence is flexible. Endurance creates pride and resentment. Presence creates understanding and release. As awareness stabilizes, pain often resolves more quickly. Not always, but even when it doesn't, it leaves less residue, less bitterness, less fear, less memories stored as trauma. Pain met with awareness also breaks isolation. You feel connected to humanity, to shared vulnerability, to the fact that pain is not a personal failure but a universal experience. This changes how you approach future pain. You don't rush ahead mentally, you don't panic, you meet it when it arrives. This reduces anticipatory suffering, which is often worse than the pain itself. Pain instructs most clearly when you stop trying to make it stop. This is the paradox. Letting go of negotiation reveals intelligence that was always there. And as this intelligence becomes familiar, another realization begins to surface. Not all suffering comes from pain itself. Some suffering is created by subtle inner rejection, by turning against experience in quiet ways. This inner violence is harder to see, but once seen, it changes everything. As pain becomes something you can stay with instead of something you fight, another layer of understanding quietly comes into view. You begin to notice that not all suffering comes from pain itself. Some of it comes from what you do to yourself in response to pain. Not loudly, not dramatically, but subtly, almost invisibly. This is where resistance crosses a line. This is where resistance stops being a reaction and becomes a form of inner harm. This kind of violence doesn't look like anger or self-hatred at first. It looks reasonable. It looks like self-control. It looks like being strong. But underneath, something is being rejected. And whatever is rejected inside doesn't disappear. It splits. Inner violence begins the moment you decide that a part of your experience is unacceptable. A feeling you shouldn't have, a thought that shouldn't arise, a weakness you shouldn't show. This decision seems small, but it has consequences. The mind divides. One part experiences, another part judges and suppresses. This division creates friction, and friction creates suffering. The mind was never meant to be at war with itself. When it is, energy drains constantly. You feel tired even when nothing has happened. Heavy even when life looks fine. This exhaustion doesn't come from circumstances, it comes from internal conflict. Subtle resistance sounds like quiet self-talk. Get over it. This is stupid. You shouldn't feel this way. These phrases are rarely questioned. They sound practical, but they carry rejection. They tell part of you that it does not belong. Over time, this creates fragmentation. Fragmentation means your experience is no longer whole. Emotions go underground, sensations tighten, thoughts loop. You may not even know what you're feeling anymore, only that something feels off. This confusion is not random. It's the result of pushing parts of yourself away. Buddhism teaches that suffering multiplies when the mind adds layers to experience. Pain is one layer. Judgment is another. Self-rejection adds a third. Each layer increases intensity. Each layer moves you further from clarity. When resistance becomes violence, it often hides behind productivity. You keep moving, you stay busy, you stay functional. But inside, something is being ignored, and ignored experiences don't dissolve, they accumulate. This accumulation shows up as tension in the body, tight shoulders, shallow breathing, clenched jaw. These are not physical habits alone, they are signals of inner refusal. The body holds what the mind rejects. Another form of inner violence is comparison, measuring your inner world against an imagined standard. Others handle this better. I should be more evolved. This comparison turns experience into a competition, and no one wins. The moment you turn against your own experience, trust breaks. You stop trusting your emotions, your instincts, your signals. This loss of trust makes life feel unsafe, even when nothing is wrong. You're no longer at home inside yourself. Inner violence also shows up as constant self-correction, trying to manage every feeling, monitor every thought, optimize every response. This hyper-management is exhausting. It comes from fear of being out of control, but it creates more instability, not less. When you reject an emotion, you don't get rid of it. You force it to express itself indirectly. Anger becomes sarcasm. Sadness becomes numbness. Fear becomes control. These indirect expressions cause more harm because they are unconscious. The mind fragments further when parts of experience are labeled as spiritual or unspiritual. Calm is allowed. Grief is not. Peace is praised. Anger is suppressed. This hierarchy creates inner conflict. Buddhism does not teach selective acceptance. It teaches wholeness. Violence against the self also includes abandoning yourself in moments of difficulty. You minimize your pain. You invalidate your struggle. You push yourself when rest is needed. This abandonment hurts because it mirrors external neglect, but now it comes from within. The most painful aspect of inner violence is that it often goes unnoticed. You think suffering is coming from outside, from circumstances, from other people, but a large portion is being generated internally through resistance. This doesn't mean you are to blame. These patterns are learned, often early, often as survival strategies. They once protected you, but now they cost more than they give. When resistance turns inward, the mind loses coherence. Thoughts feel scattered, emotions feel confusing, decisions feel harder. This is fragmentation in action. You are pulling yourself in opposite directions. Healing begins not by fixing these parts, but by allowing them to exist. When a rejected part is allowed back into awareness, integration begins. Integration reduces suffering because energy is no longer split. Inner violence ends the moment you stop arguing with your experience, not approving, not indulging, just allowing. This allowance doesn't make emotions stronger, it makes them honest. Honest emotions move. Suppressed emotions stagnate. Another form of subtle violence is demanding explanation before allowing feeling. Why do I feel this way becomes a condition for permission, but emotions don't need justification, they need space. When space is given, emotions reveal their nature. They peak, they shift, they dissolve. This natural process is blocked by resistance. Inner rejection also affects relationships. When you reject parts of yourself, you react strongly when others express those same parts. What you suppress internally becomes intolerable externally. This creates conflict that seems interpersonal but is rooted inward. Violence against the self also includes spiritual pressure. Trying to be calm too quickly, trying to transcend too soon, trying to accept before understanding. This pressure bypasses healing. It creates spiritualized suppression. True acceptance is gentle. It doesn't force transformation. It allows understanding to arise naturally. Violence rushes. Acceptance waits. The mind often fears that if it allows everything, it will lose structure. But structure built on suppression is fragile. Structure built on awareness is flexible. Integration strengthens stability. When inner violence stops, there is relief. Not dramatic, quiet. A sense of being whole again. You no longer feel split between what you feel and what you think you should feel. This wholeness reduces suffering immediately, not because pain disappears, but because it is no longer multiplied by rejection. There is also a return of curiosity. When you stop fighting yourself, you can explore experience again. You become interested instead of defensive. This curiosity is healing. Inner violence thrives on urgency. Acceptance slows things down. Slowing down reveals that most inner conflict is unnecessary. You were never in danger from your own feelings. The moment resistance becomes violence, is the moment compassion is needed most, not as an idea, but as a stance. Compassion says, this too belongs, and belonging heals fragmentation. When you allow yourself to be whole, even with discomfort, suffering loses its edge. It no longer feeds on division. It no longer echoes endlessly. When the inner war quiets and the mind stops turning against itself, something unexpected becomes possible. Feelings that were once pushed away no longer feel as threatening. They don't disappear, but they stop arriving as enemies. They wait, they linger, and if you stay present, they begin to reveal something else entirely. This is where many people hesitate, because what comes next involves emotions that were never meant to be welcomed. Yet, these emotions have been knocking for a long time, not to harm you, but to guide you. Unpleasant emotions are often treated as obstacles. Fear is seen as weakness, grief as something to move past, envy as something shameful, boredom as something to escape. From a Buddhist perspective, this misunderstanding keeps people stuck. These emotions are not blocks on the path, they are signs pointing directly toward it. Every emotion carries information. Pleasant emotions tell you when things feel aligned. Unpleasant emotions tell you when something important is being ignored. They are not mistakes in the system. They are part of the system. When listened to, they lead to clarity. When rejected, they create confusion. Fear is one of the most misunderstood messengers. Most people think fear exists to stop them. In truth, fear exists to show where attachment lives. Fear arises when something you depend on feels threatened. Safety, identity, certainty, control. When fear appears, it highlights exactly what you are clinging to. Without fear, attachment stays invisible. When fear is resisted, it grows sharper. The body tightens, the mind spirals. Fear becomes overwhelming because it is treated as danger rather than information. But when fear is met with awareness, its message becomes clearer. It shows the edge of growth, the place where something familiar is ending and something unknown is beginning. Fear does not mean stop. It means pay attention. It asks you to slow down, to feel your body, to examine what you believe you need in order to be okay. Often, fear dissolves not when the situation changes, but when attachment loosens. Grief is another emotion people try to bypass. Society encourages moving on, staying strong, finding closure. But grief is not a weakness. It is a response to impermanence. It arises because you loved, because you cared, because something mattered deeply. Grief teaches impermanence in a way no concept ever could. When grief is avoided, it turns heavy and unresolved. It leaks into the present. It dulls joy. It hardens the heart. But when grief is allowed, it becomes tender. It softens you. It deepens empathy. It opens the heart instead of closing it. Grief also teaches the truth of connection. You feel grief because you were connected, because life touched life. That connection does not disappear when the form changes. Grief is love adjusting to loss. When you stay with grief, love expands instead of contracts. Envy is perhaps one of the most rejected emotions. It is quickly labeled as bad, immature, or unspiritual. But envy contains precise information. Envy points to unacknowledged desire. It shows you what you value but may not have admitted to yourself. When ignored, envy turns into bitterness. When examined, it becomes guidance. Envy asks, what do I want that I'm afraid to want? It highlights areas of suppressed longing, not because you are lacking, but because something within you is still alive and seeking expression. Envy is not telling you to take what others have. It is telling you to recognize what you desire and understand why you believe you cannot have it. Boredom is another overlooked messenger. It is often treated as a sign that something external needs to change. More stimulation, more distraction, more activity. But boredom often arises when attention has collapsed inward, when curiosity has been numbed, when life is being lived mechanically. Boredom teaches presence. It reveals how dependent the mind is on constant stimulation. When boredom is allowed without distraction, something interesting happens. Restlessness surfaces, then subtle sensations, then awareness deepens. Beneath boredom is often untapped vitality. Boredom also points to disconnection from meaning, not grand purpose, but immediate engagement. It asks you to return to direct experience, to listen, to feel, to notice. Boredom is the doorway back to presence when the mind has gone dull. Anger, when it arises, often carries information about boundaries. Not every form of anger is destructive. When met with awareness, anger reveals where something feels violated or disrespected. It highlights where truth is being compromised. Suppressed anger turns inward and becomes self-criticism or depression. Explosive anger turns outward and causes harm, but aware anger becomes clarity. It informs action without consuming it. It says, something here matters. When listened to, it protects integrity. Sadness often signals the need to slow down, to acknowledge loss, disappointment, or unmet expectation. Sadness is not something to fix. It is something to feel fully so it can complete itself. When sadness is rushed away, it becomes lingering heaviness. When allowed, it passes naturally. Anxiety often reflects future-oriented fear. It shows how the mind leaves the present and lives in imagined outcomes. Anxiety teaches the cost of abandoning now for later. When met with awareness, anxiety guides attention back to the body, back to breath, back to what is actually happening. Shame is one of the most painful emotions and one of the most misunderstood. Shame signals fear of disconnection. It arises when you believe something about you makes you unworthy of belonging. Shame is not proof of unworthiness. It is proof of the need for compassion. When shame is hidden, it deepens. When it is met with awareness, it softens. Shame teaches the importance of acceptance, both internally and externally. It reveals how much the mind equates worth with performance or image. Guilt, when healthy, points to misalignment with values. It says something needs repair. When guilt is chronic, it becomes punishment. Awareness separates these two. It allows you to correct behavior without attacking identity. Loneliness is another powerful messenger. It reveals the human need for connection, not distraction, not validation, genuine connection. Loneliness also invites deeper relationship with oneself. When loneliness is avoided, it turns into dependence. When it is met, it becomes self-understanding. Jealousy highlights attachment to exclusivity, fear of loss, fear of replacement. When examined, it reveals insecurity and unmet needs. It asks for honesty rather than control. Each unpleasant emotion is specific. They do not shout randomly. They speak in patterns. They arise in particular situations, around particular people, under particular conditions. These patterns are maps. They show where awareness needs to go next. Buddhism does not ask you to get rid of emotions. It asks you to see them clearly, to feel them fully, to understand their nature. When emotions are understood, they lose their grip. Unpleasant emotions are not signs of failure on the path. They are evidence that something real is happening, that awareness is touching something true, that growth is underway. The problem is not the emotion. The problem is the belief that the emotion should not be there. That belief creates resistance. Resistance creates suffering. When resistance drops, emotions become teachers. These emotions don't ask to be indulged. They ask to be met. There is a difference. Indulgence reinforces patterns. Awareness dissolves them. When you allow unpleasant emotions without story, without judgment, without urgency, they reveal their structure. You see where they begin, how they move, when they end. This seeing brings freedom. Over time, you stop fearing emotions, not because they disappear, but because you trust yourself to meet them. This trust is the beginning of inner stability. As you learn to listen to these messengers, life becomes more coherent. Fewer surprises, less confusion, more understanding. You are no longer fighting your own signals. When emotions are no longer pushed away and their messages begin to make sense, something else becomes impossible to ignore. Life does not only teach through feelings, it teaches through events, through timing, through collapse, through moments when plans fall apart and effort seems to lead nowhere. These moments are often labeled as failures, as mistakes, as signs that something has gone wrong. But from a deeper view, these moments are not interruptions on the path. They are the path revealing itself more clearly. There is a strange honesty in things going wrong. Success is smooth. It flatters the ego. It confirms existing beliefs. It rarely asks deep questions. When things go right, you tend to move forward without looking too closely. You enjoy the result and assume you understand the process. But when things fall apart, attention sharpens. You stop, you look, you question. Breakdown forces contact with reality in a way comfort never does. This is why breakdowns often teach faster and deeper than peace. When something fails, illusions are exposed. Assumptions you didn't know you were living by suddenly collapse. You realize what you were relying on without awareness. Control, stability, approval, predictability. When those supports disappear, you see what remains. This seeing is not gentle, but it is precise. Buddhism speaks of dharma as truth, law, or the way things are. The dharma of things going wrong is the truth revealed when resistance no longer works, when effort fails, when strategy collapses, when the mind runs out of answers. In these moments, reality teaches directly. Breakdowns remove distraction. When life is working, the mind is busy maintaining momentum. When life breaks, momentum stops. Silence enters, and in that silence, deeper truths surface. One of the clearest teachings that comes from things going wrong is impermanence. Success creates the illusion of continuity. Breakdown shatters it. You see clearly that no state is guaranteed, no role is permanent, no structure is stable. This is not meant to create despair. It is meant to create freedom from false security. Another teaching revealed in breakdown is humility. When plans fail despite effort, intelligence, or good intentions, the ego loses its claim to control. This can feel humiliating at first, but humility is not humiliation. Humility is alignment with reality. It brings relief. You stop carrying responsibility for outcomes that were never fully yours. Things going wrong also expose attachment to outcome. You realize how much of your peace depended on specific results. When those results don't arrive, suffering spikes. This suffering is not caused by failure. It is caused by attachment. Breakdown makes this visible. Breakdowns also clarify values. When something falls apart, you quickly see what truly matters, what you miss, what you grieve, what you fight to restore. This clarity often doesn't come during success because everything feels available. Loss sharpens perception. There is also a teaching in how the mind reacts when things go wrong. Do you blame yourself? Do you blame others? Do you collapse? Do you distract? Do you become bitter? These reactions reveal conditioning, not as a theory, but as lived behavior. Awareness of these reactions is a powerful form of insight. Breakdowns also interrupt identity. Roles you relied on may disappear, titles, relationships, plans. Without them, you may feel lost. This loss of identity is painful, but it creates space. Space for a more flexible sense of self to emerge, one that is not dependent on external structure. When things go wrong, time feels different. The future becomes uncertain. The present becomes heavier. This forces presence. You can no longer live ahead of yourself comfortably. You are brought back to now, whether you like it or not. This return to now is a core teaching. Breakdowns also teach patience. Not passive waiting, but endurance without certainty. You learn to stay with unanswered questions, to function without clarity. This patience builds inner strength that success rarely requires. There is also a lesson in vulnerability. When things fall apart, you may need help, support, honesty. This can be uncomfortable, especially if identity was built on independence or competence. But vulnerability reconnects you to others and to your own humanity. Things going wrong also reveal the limits of willpower. You see that effort alone cannot guarantee results. This understanding softens self-judgment. You stop equating worth with outcomes. This is liberating. Another teaching hidden in breakdown is creativity. When old methods stop working, new ones emerge. Not immediately, often after frustration, but necessity opens doors that comfort keeps closed. Many insights, innovations, and transformations arise only because something stopped working. Breakdowns also dismantle spiritual bypassing. You cannot meditate your way out of real loss. You cannot affirm away grief. When things go wrong, spirituality must become embodied. It must meet pain honestly. This deepens practice beyond ideas. There is also a teaching in timing. Things often fall apart when they are no longer aligned. Not because you failed, but because conditions changed. Recognizing this reduces shame and increases wisdom. You learn to sense when something has reached its natural end. Things going wrong also clarify responsibility. You learn what you can influence and what you cannot. This clarity reduces wasted effort. You stop fighting uncontrollable factors and focus on what is actually workable. Breakdowns can also reveal resilience you didn't know you had. Not the kind that comes from bravado, but the quiet resilience of staying present through difficulty. This resilience builds confidence rooted in experience, not belief. There is also an honesty in breakdown about suffering. You stop pretending life is manageable at all times. You acknowledge uncertainty, fragility. This honesty creates depth. It removes superficial optimism and replaces it with grounded acceptance. Things going wrong also teach compassion for yourself, for others. You recognize that struggle is universal, that success is often temporary, that everyone carries unseen burdens. This recognition softens judgment. Breakdowns expose how much identity was invested in things working. When they stop, you confront the question of who you are without success, without progress, without validation. This question is uncomfortable, but it leads to a more stable sense of self. Another teaching is simplicity. When complexity collapses, what remains is often simple: breath, body, presence, connection. This simplicity is not deprivation, it is clarity. Things going wrong also slow you down enough to notice what was always there. Sensations, emotions, relationships. Life becomes less abstract and more immediate. This immediacy is fertile ground for insight. Breakdowns are also honest teachers because they don't negotiate. You can't argue with collapse, you can't reason your way out of loss. This forces surrender, not as defeat, but as realism. When surrender happens, energy returns. You stop fighting reality. You begin working with it. This shift often marks the turning point where suffering begins to transform. Things going wrong also reveal that peace does not come from circumstances aligning. It comes from relationship to circumstances. This realization is foundational. It changes how you meet future challenges. Breakdowns teach discernment. You learn which battles matter, which attachments are worth examining, which expectations were unrealistic. This discernment prevents repeated suffering. There is also a teaching in grief that follows breakdown. Grief honors what was real, what mattered. Allowing grief deepens connection to life rather than numbing it. Things going wrong also create honesty in communication. You stop performing, you speak more directly. This honesty strengthens relationships that can hold it and reveals which ones cannot. Breakdowns are often where spiritual understanding becomes embodied. Ideas are tested, concepts meet reality. What survives is what's real. What falls away was never integrated. The dharma of things going wrong is not that life is cruel. It is that life is truthful. It reveals what comfort hides. It teaches what ease delays. When you stop seeing breakdowns as detours and start seeing them as instruction, suffering changes shape. It no longer feels meaningless. It feels difficult but coherent. Something deep has already been proven. When life breaks down, it doesn't only hurt, it reveals. It strips away the comfortable stories and leaves you face to face with what's real. And once you've seen that breakdowns carry dharma, you start noticing something even more precise than events. You start noticing the exact places inside you that still tighten, still argue, still refuse. Those places are not random flaws. They are signals. They are the fingerprints of attachment. And if you learn how to read them, resistance stops being a problem and becomes a diagnostic tool that points straight to what you're clinging to without knowing it. There's a particular kind of discomfort that doesn't come from life itself, but from your need for life to be different. It can be small, a delay, a message left unread, someone disagreeing with you, a plan changing, a body feeling tired, a mood dropping. The mind reacts before you even notice. A tightening, a no, a subtle demand. That reaction is not just emotion, it's attachment revealing itself. Resistance is the body language of clinging. Most people think attachment means wanting nice things or loving someone too much. But in Buddhist teaching, attachment is deeper. It's the inner grip that says, I need this to be a certain way for me to be okay. It's the demand hidden inside preference. It's dependence disguised as desire. It's the belief that peace must be earned through controlling the world. Resistance shows you where that belief lives. If you want to know what you're attached to, don't look at what you say you value. Look at what you can't accept. Look at what makes you tense. Look at what triggers the urge to control, fix, avoid, or prove. Resistance is honest. It tells the truth faster than your self-image does. When you resist something, it usually means one of three things is being threatened: your comfort, your identity, or your sense of control. Each one points to a different kind of attachment, and each one can be seen clearly if you stop treating resistance like an enemy and start treating it like a signal. Start with comfort. Comfort attachment is the easiest to see and the hardest to admit because it's normal. The mind loves ease, it loves smoothness, it loves predictable pleasure. But when comfort becomes a requirement instead of a preference, resistance grows sharp. Small inconveniences feel personal. Minor stress feels unbearable. The mind starts bargaining with reality like it's negotiating with a rude cashier. This shouldn't be happening. Not today. Why now? That is comfort attachment speaking. Comfort attachment is not wrong. It's just a condition. And seeing it is freedom because it stops running your life in secret. When you notice resistance to discomfort, you begin to see how often your choices are shaped by avoidance. Not because you're weak, but because the mind has learned to equate discomfort with danger. This is where practice begins, separating discomfort from danger. The body can learn that difficulty is survivable. And when it learns that, comfort attachment loosens without force. Then there is identity attachment, which is quieter but more powerful. Identity attachment is the need to be a certain kind of person: smart, kind, strong, right, good, successful, spiritual, important. When an experience threatens that image, resistance appears instantly. Criticism lands like an attack. Failure feels like humiliation. Being misunderstood feels intolerable, not because the event is catastrophic, but because the identity is being challenged. Resistance reveals the identity you are trying to protect. Watch how you react when someone sees you differently than you want to be seen. Watch what happens when you make a mistake in public. Watch the urge to explain, justify, defend, or blame. That urge is not just communication, it's self-preservation of an image. And the more you cling to image, the more you suffer when life does what life does: change, expose, and humble. This is why resistance is such a useful diagnostic tool. It shows you exactly where your self-worth is conditional. It shows you which identities you are using as armor. And once you see that, you can begin to live from something deeper than performance. Then there is control attachment. Control attachment is the mind's constant need to manage outcomes, to predict, to guarantee, to secure. This attachment creates resistance to uncertainty. Even good uncertainty can feel stressful because it removes the illusion of knowing. Control attachment often hides behind planning, overthinking, and being responsible, but the emotional signature is clear. Tension when the future is not locked in. Resistance to uncertainty reveals attachment to certainty. Notice how the mind behaves when you don't know what will happen. It creates scenarios. It tries to solve problems that haven't arrived. It rehearses conversations that may never occur. It scans for threats. This scanning is not intelligence, it's attachment. It's the belief that peace comes from knowing. Buddhism points out that certainty is not a stable home. Everything changes. So the mind's addiction to certainty creates a constant fight with the nature of life. That fight is resistance. And the more you fight uncertainty, the more anxious you become. The path is not gaining perfect control. The path is learning to stay steady inside not knowing. Here is where resistance becomes a mirror. It reflects your hidden contract with life. The contract says, "I will be okay if life obeys." But life doesn't sign that contract. Life moves. So resistance is what happens when your contract is violated. Seeing this is not depressing, it's liberating, because you stop negotiating with a contract that was never real. Resistance also reveals attachment to emotional states. Many people are attached to being calm, happy, motivated, or inspired. They treat these states like proof that life is going well. When a negative emotion arrives, resistance appears. I shouldn't feel this. I'm going backwards. I'm failing. This is attachment to a mood. It turns the mind into a weather controller, and the weather cannot be controlled. When you resist sadness, sadness becomes heavier. When you resist fear, fear becomes panic. When you resist boredom, boredom becomes restlessness. But the deeper issue is not the emotion. It's the attachment to a preferred inner climate. That attachment creates self-judgment every time the mind changes, and the mind always changes. Resistance reveals what you demand from yourself emotionally. This is an important diagnostic. If your resistance spikes when you feel low, you may be attached to being fine. If your resistance spikes when you feel vulnerable, you may be attached to appearing strong. If your resistance spikes when you feel anger, you may be attached to being good. Each one points to a belief that certain emotions are not allowed. That belief fragments the mind and multiplies suffering. Another form of attachment revealed by resistance is attachment to other people's behavior. You may say you accept others, but your nervous system tells the truth. When someone is slow, you tense. When someone disagrees, you burn. When someone doesn't respond, you spiral. That reaction is attachment to a script. People should behave in a way that keeps me comfortable. Resistance shows where your peace depends on others. This doesn't mean you tolerate harm. It means you see the difference between boundary and control. A boundary says, "This is what I will do to protect my well-being." Control says, "You must change so I can relax." Resistance often signals that you're trying to control what you actually need to set boundaries around. When you see this, action becomes cleaner, less resentment, more clarity. Resistance can also reveal attachment to being understood. This is a painful one because it feels noble. You want to be seen, you want to be known, but when this becomes a requirement, misunderstanding becomes unbearable. You over-explain, you chase validation, you replay conversations. The mind tries to force clarity into someone else's mind. That's control attachment wearing the costume of connection. When resistance appears around being misunderstood, it often points to a deeper fear. If they don't understand me, I will be alone. That is attachment to belonging, not wrong, human. But when unconscious, it drives suffering. Resistance reveals where belonging feels unsafe. Another place resistance reveals attachment is in time. People are attached to timelines. By now, I should have healed. By now, I should be successful. By now, I should be over it. This attachment turns life into a scoreboard, and whenever reality doesn't match the timeline, resistance appears as frustration and shame. Time attachment is a demand that growth follow your schedule, but growth follows conditions, not deadlines. Healing follows readiness, not calendar dates. Buddhism teaches patience not as passive waiting, but as understanding how causes ripen. When you resist timing, you suffer twice. Once from the difficulty, and again from the belief that it shouldn't be taking this long. Resistance also reveals attachment to being in the right story. People cling to narratives. I'm the one who tries. I'm the responsible one. I'm the victim. I'm the helper. I'm the strong one. When life threatens the story, resistance flares. You defend the narrative. You reinterpret events to keep the identity stable. This is not honesty. This is clinging. Resistance shows you the story you're protecting. A powerful practice is to catch the exact moment resistance arises and ask a simple question. What am I afraid will happen if I accept this? The answer is rarely about the event itself. It's about the loss of control, loss of image, loss of comfort, or loss of certainty. In other words, it's about attachment. This question is not meant to produce a perfect answer. It's meant to turn your attention toward the hidden clinging underneath the surface reaction. Over time, you begin to recognize your personal patterns, your signature attachments. Some people cling to control, others cling to approval, others cling to independence, others cling to being right. Resistance reveals your unique shape of clinging. And once you know your shape, you stop being surprised by yourself. Resistance also has different flavors. There is hot resistance, like anger and agitation. There is cold resistance, like numbness and withdrawal. There is mental resistance, like overthinking and doubt. There is behavioral resistance, like procrastination and avoidance. Each flavor points to a different attachment strategy. Hot resistance often protects power and boundaries, but when unconscious, it protects ego pride. Cold resistance often protects vulnerability, but when unconscious, it protects fear of feeling. Mental resistance protects certainty, but when unconscious, it becomes a prison of endless analysis. Behavioral resistance protects comfort, but when unconscious, it becomes stagnation. None of these are moral failures. They are survival strategies built around attachment. Seeing them clearly turns them from unconscious drivers into conscious options. This is where resistance becomes extremely valuable. You stop trying to get rid of resistance. You start using it. You treat it like a diagnostic light on a dashboard. When the light turns on, you don't smash the dashboard. You look under the hood. You ask what condition is asking for attention. The moment you relate to resistance this way, shame drops away. You are no longer a bad person for resisting. You are simply learning where you cling, and clinging is the most human thing there is. Buddhism doesn't call you sinful for clinging, it calls you asleep, and it offers a way to wake up, see the clinging, feel the urge, soften the grip, and return to reality without violence. Another crucial part of diagnosis is noticing the body. Attachment doesn't only exist as thoughts, it exists as somatic tightening. When resistance arises, the body often contracts before the mind explains. The stomach tightens, the throat closes, the breath becomes shallow, the shoulders rise. These are not just physical reactions. They are the body's version of clinging. The body is trying to hold reality still. When you learn to notice this contraction early, you catch attachment at the root, not in the story, but in the sensation. This is powerful because stories can be convincing. The body is simpler. It tells you, gripping is happening now. From there, you can do something very direct. You can soften the jaw, relax the belly, lengthen the exhale, not to fix the situation, but to stop feeding attachment with tension. The mind learns through the body that letting go is possible. Resistance also reveals attachment through language. Listen to your inner phrases. I need, I can't. They should. This must. I always. It will never. These absolute statements are often attachment speaking. They create a narrow world. They demand certainty. They freeze reality into fixed conclusions. When you notice these phrases, you notice clinging in real time. A clean diagnostic is this. Whenever you feel the word must inside you, attachment is nearby. The goal is not to remove desire or preference. Buddhism doesn't ask you to become lifeless. It asks you to see the difference between preference and dependence. Preference says, I would like this, but I can meet reality. Dependence says, I need this, or I cannot be okay. Resistance reveals dependence. That's why it's so valuable. As you become skilled at reading resistance, you begin to change automatically. Not through force, but through clarity. You catch yourself earlier. You choose softer responses. You release faster. You stop turning discomfort into a crisis. You stop demanding that life match your inner contracts. And the biggest shift is this. You begin to respect reality more than your preferences. Not in a defeated way, in a grounded way. You stop arguing with facts. You stop wasting energy on what cannot be changed in the moment. You use your energy where it actually helps. This is how resistance becomes a diagnostic tool and not a life sentence. It becomes a guide that points to attachments that are still unconscious. And once an attachment becomes conscious, it weakens. Because attachment thrives in the dark. It survives through automatic behavior. But awareness shines light, and the grip loosens. As this grip loosens, you start to feel something new, a kind of honesty that is not harsh but fearless. You stop pretending reality is something else. You stop dressing it up or pushing it away. You see it clearly, and that kind of clear seeing requires courage. It is a radical form of truth. The next teaching lives there, in that honesty where acceptance becomes the bravest thing you can do. As resistance becomes visible and attachment loosens its grip, a different kind of tension begins to surface. It's quieter but deeper. It's the discomfort of seeing clearly, not fixing, not improving, not reframing, just seeing. And this is where many people turn away again, because seeing things exactly as they are takes more courage than trying to change them. This is where acceptance reveals its true nature, not as softness, but as radical honesty. Acceptance is often misunderstood as comfort, as relief, as a gentle exhale after struggle. But real acceptance is not always comfortable. Sometimes it is sharp. Sometimes it is sobering. Sometimes it removes illusions you were leaning on. Acceptance asks you to stop editing reality to protect your feelings. It asks you to look without filters. And that takes strength. Changing things can feel empowering. You act, you plan, you try. There is movement, there is hope. But acceptance asks for something different. It asks you to pause the movement long enough to see what is actually happening. Not what you want to believe is happening. Not what you hope will happen next. What is happening now? This is why acceptance is an act of honesty. And honesty can be destabilizing. The mind is very skilled at negotiation. It reframes, it rationalizes, It justifies. It tells partial truths that feel easier to live with. It's not that bad. This will pass. I'm fine. These statements are not always lies, but they are often incomplete. Acceptance asks for completeness. It asks you to acknowledge the full picture, including the parts that make you uncomfortable. Radical honesty begins when you stop lying to yourself about what hurts. This doesn't mean exaggerating pain. It means naming it accurately, saying this is painful, saying I'm scared, saying I'm lonely, saying I don't know. These are not weak statements, they are truthful ones, and truth stabilizes the mind more than false positivity ever could. Acceptance is radical because it removes excuses. When you see things clearly, you can no longer hide behind confusion. You can no longer pretend you don't know what you know. This clarity can feel heavy at first because it brings responsibility, not blame, responsibility. Seeing that a relationship is unhealthy hurts more than pretending it's fine. Seeing that you are burned out hurts more than staying busy. Seeing that you are avoiding grief hurts more than distracting yourself. But once you see these things, you are no longer trapped by them. You are informed. This is why acceptance is not passive. It is active perception. Most people try to change their feelings before understanding them. They want relief before truth. Acceptance reverses that order. It says, let's be honest first. And honesty often brings discomfort before relief. There is also courage required to accept limitations. Physical limits, emotional limits, situational limits. The mind prefers limitless potential. It resists the idea that some things cannot be changed right now. Acceptance acknowledges limits without collapsing into despair. It says, this is the current boundary, and from that boundary, realistic action becomes possible. Denial creates false hope. Acceptance creates grounded hope. Radical honesty also applies to desire. Accepting what you want can be uncomfortable, especially if it conflicts with your self-image. You may want rest, but identify as productive. You may want connection, but identify as independent. You may want change, but fear disruption. Acceptance asks you to admit desire without shame. This admission is freeing. When you deny desire, it controls you unconsciously. When you accept desire, you can relate to it wisely. Acceptance also requires honesty about emotions that don't fit your narrative. Anger when you think you should be kind. Envy when you think you should be content. Boredom when you think you should be grateful. These emotions don't disappear because they are inconvenient. Acceptance allows them to exist without turning them into identity. This honesty prevents self-deception. You stop pretending to be calmer than you are, more healed than you are, more evolved than you are. And paradoxically, this honesty accelerates growth. Another form of radical honesty is acknowledging impermanence, accepting that things you love will change, that roles will end, that certainty is temporary. The mind resists this truth because it threatens stability. But resisting impermanence doesn't make life safer, it makes loss more painful. Acceptance doesn't eliminate grief, it prepares you for it. There is also honesty in seeing patterns without self-judgment. You notice how you react, how you avoid, how you cling, without calling yourself broken. This neutral observation is radical because the mind is addicted to moralizing. Acceptance observes without condemnation. Condemnation feels like accountability, but it's actually avoidance. It avoids seeing clearly by collapsing into shame. Acceptance stays upright. It looks directly. Radical honesty also means accepting ambiguity. Not everything has a clear explanation. Not every feeling has a neat origin. Not every problem has an immediate solution. The mind wants closure. Acceptance allows openness. This openness reduces pressure. When you stop forcing meaning, meaning emerges naturally. Acceptance requires courage because it removes the fantasy of control. You see what you can influence and what you cannot. This clarity can feel humbling, but humility is stabilizing. You stop overreaching. You stop blaming yourself for outcomes beyond your control. There is honesty in acknowledging effort without guaranteeing results. You can do your best and still fail. Acceptance allows you to hold this truth without collapse. You stop equating worth with success. Radical honesty also applies to healing, accepting that healing is uneven, that progress is not linear, that old patterns can resurface. This honesty prevents despair. You stop demanding perfection from yourself. When you accept your current stage, you work with it instead of against it. Acceptance is also honest about fear. Instead of pretending you're brave, you admit fear and act anyway when needed. Courage is not the absence of fear, it is honesty about fear. There is honesty in accepting that some relationships will not change. Some people will not understand you. Some conversations will not resolve. Acceptance allows you to stop chasing closure that isn't available. This saves enormous energy. Radical honesty also includes accepting joy when it arises, without suspicion. Some people resist joy because it feels fragile. Acceptance allows joy to be experienced fully, without clinging. Acceptance is not neutral, it is intimate. It brings you closer to experience, closer to sensation, closer to truth. This closeness can feel intense, but it is also grounding. One of the deepest forms of honesty is accepting that you don't always know what's best. The ego resists this, it wants certainty. Acceptance allows learning. You become receptive. Acceptance also reveals where you've been pretending for approval, living according to expectations, suppressing parts of yourself to fit. Seeing this clearly can hurt, but it also opens the door to authenticity. Radical honesty asks you to see your life as it is, not as a project to fix, but as a reality to understand. From understanding, change becomes intelligent. When you stop arguing with reality, you hear it. And reality is always giving information. Acceptance is the willingness to receive that information without distortion. This honesty creates a solid foundation. You stop building your life on wishful thinking. You build it on what's real. This doesn't make life smaller, it makes it workable. Acceptance also requires honesty about timing. Some changes are not ready. Forcing them creates harm. Acceptance waits without giving up. Radical honesty is also gentle. It does not attack. It does not shame. It does not dramatize. It simply states what is true and stays present with it. This presence reduces anxiety because anxiety feeds on avoidance. When everything is allowed into awareness, there is less to fear. Acceptance as honesty also dissolves self-betrayal. You stop saying yes when you mean no. You stop ignoring your body. You stop overriding intuition. This alignment creates integrity. Integrity brings peace, not because life is perfect, but because you are no longer divided against yourself. Seeing things exactly as they are is difficult because it removes the comfort of illusion. But illusion always costs more in the long run. Acceptance pays up front, and the reward is clarity. When you begin to see clearly and stop lying to yourself, there is often a surprising moment of frustration. You've accepted what is, you've faced the truth, you've stopped running, and yet some things still don't change. The same patterns return, the same reactions appear, the same situations repeat themselves in new forms. This is usually the point where people feel discouraged and quietly conclude that acceptance doesn't work. But this moment is not a failure, it is a deeper invitation. Because what refuses to change is not blocking you, it is teaching you something you have not yet seen. Not all wisdom speaks loudly. Some of it is persistent, some of it repeats itself until you stop trying to move past it and start listening to it. Repeated patterns are not mistakes in your growth. They are signals that the lesson is not where you think it is. The mind often assumes that growth means change on the surface, new behavior, new outcomes, new circumstances. But Buddhism points to something subtler, Sometimes transformation is not about replacing a pattern, but about understanding why it exists. When understanding is incomplete, the pattern remains, not to punish you, but to stay visible. When something refuses to change, it usually means one of three things. Either the pattern is protecting you in a way you haven't acknowledged, or the lesson is deeper than behavior, or the conditions for change are not yet complete. All three require patience, not force. One of the most common misunderstandings is trying to eliminate a pattern instead of learning from it. You may want anxiety to disappear, but anxiety might be showing you how much you rely on certainty. You may want a relationship pattern to stop repeating, but it may be revealing how you abandon yourself to maintain connection. You may want self-doubt to end, but it may be pointing to how your worth is tied to performance. Until these insights are fully embodied, the pattern stays. Patterns repeat because they are functional. Even painful ones serve a purpose. They regulate emotions. They maintain identity. They preserve a sense of safety. The mind does not let go of what it believes is keeping you alive. So when a pattern persists, it's worth asking, what is this protecting me from? This question shifts the tone from frustration to curiosity. Often, repeated patterns are built around early conditioning, ways you learn to survive emotionally, ways you learn to stay connected, ways you learn to avoid harm. These strategies worked once. They may no longer be needed, but the nervous system doesn't update automatically. It updates through felt safety, not logic. This is why insight alone doesn't always create change. You can understand a pattern intellectually and still feel pulled by it emotionally. The body has its own timeline. Repetition gives the body time to learn something new. What refuses to change also reveals where acceptance is still partial. You may accept a situation mentally, but still resist it emotionally. You may accept pain, but still demand resolution. You may accept uncertainty, but still seek control in subtle ways. The pattern continues because some layer of resistance remains unnoticed. This doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. It means awareness is still unfolding. There is also wisdom in recognizing that not everything is meant to change quickly. Some patterns dissolve slowly, like ice melting. If you try to rush that process, you create more tension. Tension reinforces the pattern. Patience allows it to soften. Repeated patterns also show you what you are identified with. If a behavior keeps returning, it may be tied to how you see yourself. Letting go of the behavior would mean letting go of an identity. That loss can feel frightening, even if the identity causes suffering. For example, someone who identifies as the caretaker may repeatedly attract situations where they are needed, even when exhausted, even when resentful. The pattern persists not because they enjoy suffering, but because the identity feels meaningful. Until that meaning is examined, the pattern remains. Another person may repeatedly sabotage opportunities, not because they don't want success, but because success threatens belonging or safety. The pattern protects something deeper than comfort. When you stop judging the pattern and start listening to it, its intelligence becomes clearer. There is also a lesson in how you respond to the repetition. Do you become impatient? Do you shame yourself? Do you give up? These responses add a second layer of suffering. The original pattern may be neutral. Your reaction to it determines how painful it feels. Buddhism teaches that suffering is not just about what happens, but about how the mind meets what happens. Repeated patterns test this teaching. They ask whether you can stay present without demanding progress. Progress is often quieter than you expect. Sometimes the pattern doesn't change, but your relationship to it does. You notice it sooner, you react less intensely, you recover faster. These are not small shifts. They are signs of integration, but the mind often dismisses them because it is looking for dramatic transformation. What refuses to change may also be showing you where compassion is needed toward yourself. toward your history, toward the parts of you that learn to cope in difficult conditions. Forcing change without compassion recreates inner violence. Compassion creates safety. Safety allows release. There is also wisdom in recognizing when effort is the wrong tool. Some patterns persist because you are trying to fix them instead of understanding them. Effort can harden resistance. Understanding softens it. When transformation feels blocked, it's often because the mind is trying to control the outcome instead of meeting the process. Life does not respond to force in these areas. It responds to presence. Repeated patterns also teach humility. They remind you that growth is not a straight line, that insight doesn't make you immune to conditioning, that being aware doesn't mean being finished. This humility is stabilizing. It prevents spiritual arrogance and self-judgment alike. Some patterns persist because they are not yours alone. They belong to family systems, cultural conditioning, collective trauma. You may be carrying something larger than your personal story. Seeing this reduces self-blame and opens space for wiser engagement. What refuses to change can also be pointing to an unmet need. A need for rest, for safety, for expression, for connection. Until the need is acknowledged and addressed, the pattern remains as a signal. For example, procrastination may not be laziness. It may be exhaustion. Avoidance may not be fear. It may be overwhelm. Numbness may not be indifference. It may be overload. When you meet the underlying need, the pattern loosens without struggle. Repeated patterns also reveal where you are ahead of yourself. Wanting transformation faster than integration can happen. Wanting closure before understanding. Wanting peace before truth. This impatience is human, but it adds pressure. Pressure delays learning. The silent wisdom of repetition asks you to slow down. There is also teaching in the exact form the pattern takes. When does it appear? With whom? Under what conditions? At what emotional temperature? These details are not random, they are data. They show the pattern's function. Buddhist practice encourages careful observation without interference. Not to analyze endlessly, but to see clearly. When you observe a pattern without trying to change it, it often changes on its own. Not because you controlled it, but because awareness reorganized it. Sometimes what refuses to change is not meant to change at all. Some limitations are part of being human. Sensitivity, vulnerability, aging, loss. These are not problems to solve. They are realities to relate to wisely. Trying to change them creates suffering. Accepting them creates depth. Distinguishing between what can change and what must be accepted is a form of wisdom. Repeated frustration often comes from trying to change what requires acceptance or accepting what requires action. Patterns help clarify this distinction. There is also wisdom in recognizing when you are trying to transform to escape discomfort rather than to understand life. Transformation driven by avoidance creates new patterns. Transformation driven by insight creates freedom. What refuses to change often holds the key to your deepest attachment. The thing you want to be done with the most is often the thing asking for the most honesty. Not more effort, more presence. Repetition can also teach trust. Trust that life is not done with you, that growth is still happening even when it feels stuck, that learning continues beneath the surface. Many people abandon practice at this stage because they confuse repetition with failure. But repetition is not regression, it is refinement. Each time a pattern returns, you meet it with slightly more awareness, slightly less fear, slightly more space. These subtle shifts accumulate. One day, the pattern no longer needs to return, not because you defeated it, but because it completed its teaching. And when that happens, it often feels quiet. Not dramatic, not triumphant, just simple. The pattern no longer has work to do. The silent wisdom of what refuses to change is patience. It teaches you to stop chasing transformation and start embodying understanding. After watching patterns repeat and learning not to rush their disappearance, something subtle begins to relax. The constant effort to fix, understand, or improve softens. The grip loosens. And in that loosening, a quiet shift happens that many people don't expect. Insight begins to appear on its own, not because you forced it, not because you analyzed harder, but because you finally stopped interfering. This is the moment where letting be reveals its quiet power. Letting be is often misunderstood as doing nothing, as giving up, as disengagement. But letting be is not absence of awareness. It is the absence of interference. It is the mind stepping out of its own way. And when the mind stops obstructing itself, it reorganizes naturally, the way a shaken glass of water settles when left alone. For a long time, effort felt necessary. You tried to think your way through pain. You tried to understand every reaction. You tried to manage emotions, correct thoughts, adjust behavior. This effort wasn't wrong. It brought you to the edge. But beyond that edge, effort becomes noise. It keeps the mind busy when what's needed is space. The mind is not broken. It doesn't need to be fixed. It needs conditions where it can settle. Letting be creates those conditions. When resistance dissolves, the nervous system relaxes. Not all at once, not dramatically, but enough for perception to widen. Thoughts slow down without being pushed. Emotions move without being blocked. Sensations are felt without commentary. In this environment, insight arises naturally. The way understanding appears when you stop arguing with facts. One of the biggest misunderstandings is believing insight comes from effortful thinking. In reality, thinking often delays insight. It keeps you circling the same material from different angles, mistaking movement for progress. Letting be interrupts this loop. It removes mental friction, and when friction is gone, clarity appears. Insight is not created, it is revealed. When you stop analyzing, the mind begins to connect things on its own, not through logic, but through recognition. You suddenly see why a pattern existed, why a reaction kept happening, why a situation felt stuck. This seeing is not linear. It arrives whole, quiet, obvious. And once seen, it cannot be unseen. This is why insight often feels simple in hindsight. You wonder how you missed it, but you didn't miss it. You were too busy trying to get somewhere else. Letting be also reorganizes attention. Instead of being pulled constantly into thought, attention rests more in direct experience, in the body, in sensation, in the present moment. This grounded attention stabilizes the mind. From stability, understanding deepens. When attention is scattered, insight is fragmented. When attention is settled, insight integrates. Another important shift is that letting be removes urgency. Urgency is one of the biggest obstacles to insight. When you feel pressured to understand, pressured to heal, pressured to change, the mind tightens. Tightness narrows perception. Letting be removes the pressure, and with pressure gone, the mind opens. Openness is the soil insight grows in. Letting be also changes how memory operates. Instead of replaying the past compulsively, memories surface when they are relevant. You don't force reflection. Reflection arises. A memory appears, not as rumination, but as context. It shows you something new about an old experience. This is natural integration. When resistance dissolves, the mind trusts itself more. It no longer believes it must control every process. This trust allows unconscious material to surface safely. Feelings, realizations, and connections emerge without overwhelm. The mind processes what it's ready to process. Insight does not rush. It respects timing. Letting be also reduces inner commentary. The constant narrator quiets. You're no longer explaining experience to yourself in real time. This silence is not empty, it's receptive. In that receptivity, subtle insights appear, not as thoughts, but as shifts in understanding. These shifts often show up as changes in behavior without decision. You respond differently without planning to. You don't react where you used to. You choose rest where you used to push. You speak honestly where you used to avoid. These changes are signs that the mind has reorganized at a deeper level. Effort changes behavior temporarily. Insight changes behavior permanently. Letting be also reveals the intelligence of the mind-body system. When you stop forcing, the body releases tension on its own. Breathing deepens naturally. Posture adjusts. Energy flows more evenly. These physical shifts support mental clarity. You think better when the body is not braced. This is why over-efforting often leads to burnout. It ignores the body's role in understanding. Letting be brings the body back into the process. Another aspect of letting be is allowing emotions to complete themselves. When you don't interfere, emotions rise, peak, and fall. This completion frees mental space. Unfinished emotions occupy attention. Completed emotions release it. With more space, insight becomes possible. Letting be also dismantles the belief that you must constantly work on yourself. This belief creates endless dissatisfaction. There is always something to improve, something to fix, something to transcend. Letting be introduces a radical alternative, allowing yourself to be exactly where you are without conditions. This allowance does not freeze growth. It accelerates it. When you stop demanding change, change happens organically. The mind no longer rebels against pressure. It cooperates with reality. This cooperation allows learning to integrate. Insight also arises because letting be reduces fear. Fear constricts awareness. When fear softens, awareness expands. Expanded awareness sees connections fear could not tolerate. For example, you may suddenly understand that a fear you've carried was never about the present situation. It was about an old wound. This understanding doesn't come from analysis. It comes from safety. When the nervous system feels safe enough, it allows truth to surface. Letting be creates safety. Another reorganization happens in values. When you stop forcing outcomes, you become clearer about what truly matters. Not what looks good, not what you thought you wanted, but what actually nourishes you. This clarity changes decisions without effort. Letting be also reveals the difference between control and influence. You see what you can affect and what you cannot. This distinction reduces frustration. You stop wasting energy on the impossible. You focus on what's workable. Insight is often about subtraction, not addition. Letting be removes false assumptions, false urgency, false responsibility. What remains is simpler and more accurate. Letting be also breaks the habit of self-surveillance. You stop watching yourself constantly. This reduces performance anxiety. You become more authentic. Authenticity creates coherence. Coherence supports clarity. Another important change is how the mind relates to not knowing. Instead of rushing to answers, you become comfortable with open questions. This comfort allows deeper answers to emerge over time. Not forced answers, real ones. Insight often comes after you stop looking for it. Letting be also shifts how you listen to yourself, to others. You hear more, you interrupt less, you respond instead of react. This listening reveals information you missed before. When resistance dissolves, the mind becomes less defensive. Defensiveness blocks learning. Openness invites it. Another reorganization occurs in identity. You stop trying to be someone specific. The need to define yourself relaxes. Without rigid identity, experience flows more freely. You're not constantly checking whether something fits your story. This freedom allows new perspectives. Letting be does not mean drifting aimlessly. It means aligning with reality instead of fighting it. Alignment creates momentum without strain. There is also a shift in how mistakes are processed. Without resistance, mistakes become information instead of evidence of failure. This changes how quickly you learn. You adjust naturally, no shame required. Insight arising from letting be feels different from insight gained through effort. It feels gentle, non-confrontational, almost obvious. You don't feel the need to announce it. It simply becomes part of how you see. This kind of insight is stable because it is embodied. It lives in perception, not belief. Letting be also changes your relationship with silence. Silence stops feeling empty or awkward. It becomes fertile. Insight often appears in silence because silence is where nothing is being pushed away. Another subtle shift is the end of inner commentary about progress. You stop asking, "Am I doing this right?" This question dissolves when you trust the process. Trust allows deeper relaxation. Deeper relaxation allows deeper understanding. Letting be is not a technique. It's a stance, a willingness to stop interfering with experience. When adopted consistently, the mind reorganizes itself around truth instead of defense. This reorganization doesn't happen once. It happens in layers. Each time resistance dissolves, another layer integrates. Each time you let be, another piece falls into place. The beauty of this process is that it requires no special ability, no belief, no perfection, just willingness to stop pushing. As insight begins to arise without force and the mind learns to settle on its own, another habit becomes visible. It's an old one, deeply respected, often praised. The habit of enduring, of pushing through, of holding on until it's over. Many people believe this is strength, and sometimes it is. But often, endurance is confused with understanding. And this confusion quietly extends suffering far beyond what is necessary. There is a certain pride in saying, "I can handle it," a belief that pain proves character, that struggle builds worth, that staying hard protects you. This belief is not accidental. It is taught, it is reinforced. But Buddhism makes a clear distinction here. Endurance is not the same as wisdom. And surviving something is not the same as learning from it. Endurance is about resisting collapse. Understanding is about seeing clearly. When you tough something out, you tighten, you brace, you hold your breath emotionally and sometimes physically. The mind narrows, the body contracts. The goal becomes getting through. This can be useful in emergencies. But when endurance becomes the default response to inner difficulty, it turns into quiet violence against yourself. Endurance says, "I will not break." Understanding asks, "What is happening?" Endurance ignores signals. Understanding listens to them. When you endure pain without awareness, you suppress information. You push past discomfort without learning what it's trying to show you. The pain may eventually pass, but the lesson doesn't land. So the same pain returns later, in a different form. This is why people say they've been strong their whole lives, but still feel exhausted. They survived, but they didn't integrate. Understanding shortens suffering because it completes the process. Endurance keeps you in time, waiting for the pain to end. Understanding brings you into the present, meeting pain as it is. Pain is always happening now. Suffering is created when the mind lives ahead of itself, counting how long it has lasted or how long it might continue. When you endure, you live in anticipation. When you understand, you live in contact. Endurance also creates identity. I am someone who can handle pain. This identity can become a trap. It discourages rest. It discourages asking for help. It discourages vulnerability. Over time, it isolates you from yourself and others. Understanding dissolves this identity. It replaces it with responsiveness. Understanding does not mean weakness, it means precision. There is also a difference in how the body responds. Endurance keeps the nervous system in a low-level fight-or-flight state. Even when you're calm on the surface, the body is braced. Muscles stay tight, breathing stays shallow. Over time, this creates chronic tension and fatigue. Understanding allows the body to soften. Softening does not mean collapsing. It means releasing unnecessary effort. This release frees energy for healing and insight. Another difference lies in how emotions are processed. Endurance suppresses emotion. It tells fear, grief, or anger to wait. Understanding invites emotion into awareness without judgment. This invitation allows emotion to move and complete itself. Suppressed emotion lingers. Understood emotion passes. Endurance often delays grief. Understanding allows grief to be felt. Delayed grief doesn't disappear. It shows up later as numbness, irritability, or despair. Allowing grief shortens its lifespan. Understanding also changes how memory is stored. Endured pain becomes trauma. Understood pain becomes experience. Trauma is pain that was not integrated. Experience is pain that was met with awareness. This is why two people can go through similar events and be shaped very differently. One endures and carries the weight for years. The other understands and carries wisdom instead. Endurance focuses on control. Understanding focuses on relationship. You cannot control pain away, but you can relate to it wisely. Relationship transforms experience. Control intensifies conflict. Endurance also tends to ignore boundaries. You push past limits because stopping feels like failure. Understanding respects limits. It knows when rest is needed, when action is needed, when support is needed. This respect prevents burnout. Another key difference is how each responds to repetition. When the same issue returns, endurance feels defeated. Why am I still dealing with this? Understanding becomes curious. What hasn't been seen yet? This curiosity opens new layers of insight. Endurance often relies on willpower. Willpower is finite. It runs out. Understanding relies on awareness. Awareness does not deplete, it expands. Endurance also hardens perception. You become less sensitive because sensitivity feels dangerous. Understanding increases sensitivity without overwhelm. You become more attuned, not more fragile. Understanding also reduces fear of pain. Not because pain disappears, but because you trust your ability to meet it. Endurance creates fear of breaking. Understanding creates confidence in resilience. Another difference is in how each handles uncertainty. Endurance demands certainty. Just tell me when this will end. Understanding tolerates uncertainty. It stays present without guarantees. This tolerance reduces anxiety. Endurance often comes with self-judgment. I should be stronger. Others have it worse. Understanding removes comparison. It honors experience without ranking. Understanding also changes how you learn. Instead of learning through repeated suffering, you learn through awareness. This makes growth gentler and faster. Endurance keeps you stuck in reaction. Understanding creates response. Reaction is automatic and unconscious. Response is chosen and informed. Endurance often leads to emotional shutdown. Understanding leads to emotional intelligence. You learn the language of your own experience. Another difference lies in time. Endurance extends suffering because it resists it. Understanding shortens suffering by meeting it. Pain that is fully met does not linger. Endurance builds walls. Understanding builds bridges. Bridges between body and mind, between emotion and insight, between pain and meaning. Understanding also allows humor to return. Not forced positivity, but lightness that comes from perspective. Endurance is heavy. Understanding has space. Endurance often isolates. Understanding connects. You feel less alone because you recognize your experience as human, not personal failure. Understanding also reshapes motivation. You stop pushing yourself to prove worth. You act from care instead of pressure. There is also a moral dimension. Endurance can become self-righteous. I suffered, so others should too. Understanding breeds compassion. You don't wish unnecessary pain on anyone. Endurance can coexist with denial. Understanding cannot. It requires honesty. Understanding also brings forgiveness, not as an idea, but as a natural release when resentment is seen clearly. Endurance often leads to delayed collapse. Understanding prevents collapse by addressing strain early. Another subtle difference is how silence is experienced. Endurance fills silence with tension. Understanding allows silence to be restful. Understanding also sharpens discernment. You learn when to stay and when to leave, when to speak and when to be quiet. Endurance keeps you stuck in extremes. Understanding does not mean you never endure. There are moments where endurance is necessary, but endurance without understanding is incomplete. It must be followed by reflection, feeling, and integration. When endurance becomes your identity, suffering becomes your companion. When understanding becomes your practice, suffering becomes your teacher. This is why mindful acceptance shortens suffering. It doesn't resist pain. It doesn't dramatize it. It meets it fully. And what is fully met does not need to repeat. Understanding also creates dignity. You don't minimize your experience. You don't exaggerate it. You honor it. As the difference between endurance and understanding becomes clear, another truth quietly steps forward. Much of what you have been resisting was never about the pain itself. It was about what the pain pointed to: change, loss, uncertainty, the slow, undeniable movement of life. This is where resistance reveals its deepest root. Beneath anger, beneath fear, beneath control, there is a refusal to face impermanence, and that refusal shapes far more suffering than we realize. There is something deeply unsettling about things not staying the same. Even when change is gentle, it carries a quiet threat. It reminds you that nothing you hold is guaranteed. Not relationships, not health, not identity, not even this moment. Resistance often begins right here, not because the present is unbearable, but because it is unstable. Impermanence is not an abstract idea. It is felt in the body, in the tightening when something shifts, in the sadness when something fades, in the anxiety when the future feels open. Resistance is the mind's attempt to freeze what is moving, to hold what is already slipping. The present moment is always changing. Even as you notice it, it is already different. This constant movement is subtle, but the nervous system senses it. And when the nervous system has learned to equate stability with safety, impermanence feels like danger. Resistance becomes a defense. This is why people resist feelings. Emotions change identity. They move you from one state to another. Joy fades, sadness arrives, fear rises, calm dissolves. The mind resists these shifts because each one reminds it that nothing lasts. Resistance tries to lock in preferred states and push away unwanted ones, but both actions are rooted in the same fear. Fear of impermanence is not dramatic. It shows up quietly, in clinging, in hesitation, in postponing grief, in avoiding endings, in staying in situations that no longer fit. Resistance whispers, if I don't look, maybe it won't change. But change does not wait for permission. Loss is one of the clearest teachers of impermanence. When something or someone leaves, resistance often flares. This shouldn't have happened. It's not fair. I wasn't ready. These reactions are human, but beneath them is a deeper refusal, the refusal to accept that all forms dissolve. Grief hurts because attachment met impermanence directly. Resistance tries to turn grief into something else: distraction, numbness, anger, busyness. But grief is not the enemy. Grief is love encountering change. Resistance to grief is resistance to the truth that love cannot protect against loss. The fear of death is the deepest expression of impermanence. You may not think about death often, but the fear shapes many behaviors. The drive to achieve, to be remembered, to stay busy, to avoid stillness. Resistance to the present moment is often resistance to the reminder that time is moving. When the mind resists the present, it usually jumps into the future or the past, planning, regretting, replaying. These movements feel safer than staying here, where change is undeniable. The present moment has no guarantees. The future feels like it might. Resistance also shows up as clinging to identity. This is who I am. But identity is not stable. It shifts with age, experience, and circumstance. When identity changes, resistance appears. You mourn who you were, you fear who you might become. Acceptance asks you to let identity be fluid. Resistance tries to keep it fixed. Impermanence threatens control. If things change, control weakens. Resistance becomes an attempt to manage outcomes, but outcomes are not stable. The more you try to control change, the more anxious you become. This anxiety is not caused by impermanence, it is caused by fighting it. Buddhism teaches that impermanence is not a flaw in life. It is life. Everything that arises passes. This includes pain. This includes joy. This includes you. When this truth is resisted, suffering multiplies. When it is accepted, life becomes lighter. Resistance often shows up as nostalgia, longing for how things were. This longing can be sweet, but when it becomes a refusal to live now, it creates suffering. Nostalgia freezes life in memory and rejects the living present. Another form of resistance to impermanence is perfectionism. The belief that if everything is just right, it can stay that way. Perfectionism is not about excellence. It is about fear of change. It creates constant tension because perfection cannot hold against time. Resistance also appears as urgency, the rush to secure happiness before it disappears, the pressure to achieve before it's too late. This urgency steals presence. It makes life feel like a race against decay. Acceptance removes the race. It allows life to unfold at its own pace. When you resist impermanence, you often resist rest. Rest slows time. It brings awareness back to the body. The body ages. The body changes. Rest makes this visible. Busyness hides it. Resistance chooses busyness. There is also resistance in refusing to grieve small losses, missed opportunities, faded friendships, changing seasons. These losses accumulate when unacknowledged. They create background sadness. Accepting impermanence means allowing yourself to grieve continuously, gently, instead of all at once. Resistance to impermanence also affects how you love. You may hold back, fearing loss, or you may cling, fearing separation. Both are attempts to manage impermanence. True love does not deny change. It exists fully within it. The present moment asks for courage because it offers no permanence. It offers experience, not stability. Resistance says, "Give me certainty first." Acceptance says, "I will meet what is here." When you reject the present moment, you are often rejecting the reminder that this moment will never happen again. That reminder can feel heavy, but it can also be precious. Impermanence gives value to experience. Without it, nothing would matter. Resistance to impermanence also fuels anger. Anger often arises when reality changes without consent. Someone leaves, a plan fails, a body breaks. Anger tries to restore a sense of control. It says, "This should not be happening." Acceptance says, "This is happening." This doesn't mean you don't act. It means you act from clarity, not denial. Another subtle resistance is hope used as escape. Hope can be healthy, but it can also be a way to avoid now. Things will get better. Maybe they will, but now still exists, and now is where life happens. Resistance also appears in spiritual bypassing, using ideas of transcendence to avoid facing change. Impermanence is not transcended, it is realized, it is embodied. Avoiding it keeps suffering alive. When impermanence is accepted, fear loosens. Not because loss disappears, but because you stop being surprised by it. You expect change. You meet it with less shock. This preparedness is not pessimism, it is realism. Accepting impermanence also softens attachment. You still care, you still love, but you hold more gently. You appreciate without clinging. This reduces suffering without dulling joy. Resistance to impermanence keeps you living in anticipation or regret. Acceptance brings you back to presence. Presence is the only place where peace can exist. Impermanence also teaches humility. You realize you are part of a larger flow, not in control, but not powerless either. You participate instead of dominate. This participation feels lighter. When you stop resisting impermanence, you stop demanding permanence from what cannot provide it. This single shift reduces enormous suffering. You begin to allow endings, conversations end, days end, phases end, relationships change. You stop clinging to continuity. You let life move. Acceptance of impermanence also deepens gratitude. Not forced gratitude, but natural appreciation. You value moments because they are fleeting. You pay attention because nothing repeats. Resistance to impermanence narrows life. Acceptance expands it. This acceptance does not remove sadness. It makes sadness clean. It does not remove fear. It makes fear workable. It does not remove death. It makes life more alive. The present moment is fragile. That fragility is not a problem. It is the reason to be here. As resistance to impermanence softens, the mind often reaches for one last line of defense. It doesn't look like anger. It doesn't look like fear. It looks like a question that feels reasonable, even deep. Why me? It rises quietly in moments of pain, loss, illness, betrayal, or collapse. And although it sounds like a search for meaning, it often carries a hidden cost. This question can either open the door to wisdom or lock you deeper into suffering, depending on where it comes from. The words, "why me?" are not neutral. They carry a posture. When they arise from resistance, they turn life into a courtroom. Reality becomes the accused. You become the victim. And suffering becomes personal, targeted, unfair. This posture feels natural, but it quietly multiplies pain. The moment the mind asks, "why me?" from resistance, it assumes something has gone wrong. It assumes the event should not have happened. It assumes there was an alternative version of reality where you were spared. These assumptions create a split between what is and what you believe should be. That split is where suffering lives. This question often hides a demand. Why me can mean, why wasn't I protected? Why didn't life choose someone else? Why am I being tested? Underneath, there is a belief that suffering should be distributed differently, more fairly, more selectively. This belief may feel justified, but it places you in opposition to reality. When you ask "why me?" from resistance, you are not seeking understanding. You are seeking exemption. And life does not grant exemptions. This doesn't mean suffering is deserved. It means suffering is not personal. It arises from causes and conditions, not moral judgment. When the mind personalizes suffering, it adds a layer of isolation. You feel singled out, alone, unlucky. This isolation deepens pain. The spiritual cost of "why me?" is that it reinforces identity around suffering. You become the one this happened to. The story tightens. The event hardens into narrative. Narrative solidifies identity. Identity keeps the wound alive. This question also freezes the mind in the past. It keeps you looking backward, searching for reasons, assigning blame, replaying scenarios. The present moment is abandoned. And healing cannot happen outside the present. Another cost is loss of humility. Not humility as weakness, but humility as alignment with reality. When you ask, "why me?" there is often an unspoken belief that you should have been spared, that you were somehow above this. That belief creates dissonance when life proves otherwise. Resistance-based questioning also blocks learning. When the mind is busy arguing with what happened, it cannot listen to what the experience is teaching. The lesson is missed. The pain remains unresolved. There is also a subtle moralization in "why me?" It implies that suffering should follow rules, that good behavior should protect you, that effort should guarantee outcomes. When this belief collapses, the mind scrambles for explanation. It asks, "why me?" instead of asking, "what is here?" The mind prefers explanations over acceptance. Explanations feel like control. Acceptance feels like vulnerability, but explanations often fail to satisfy. They circle endlessly. Acceptance settles. This does not mean inquiry is wrong. Buddhism values inquiry deeply, but there is a difference between inquiry that resists reality and inquiry that opens to it. Inquiry from resistance asks, "Why did this happen to me?" Inquiry from acceptance asks, "What is happening now?" One looks for blame or meaning in the past. The other looks for understanding in the present. Inquiry from resistance narrows. Inquiry from acceptance widens. When you ask, "Why me?" from resistance, the question often leads to comparisons. Others have it easier. Others don't suffer like this. Comparison isolates. It turns suffering into a competition. This adds resentment to pain. Inquiry from acceptance does not compare. It recognizes suffering as universal, different in form, similar in nature. This recognition brings connection instead of isolation. Another cost of resistance-based questioning is spiritual bypassing. You may look for cosmic reasons, lessons assigned by fate, tests from the universe. These ideas can feel comforting, but they often keep you from feeling what is actually happening. They turn pain into abstraction. Acceptance-based inquiry stays grounded. It asks, "What am I feeling? Where is this in my body? What does this experience need right now?" These questions do not escape pain. They meet it. The question, "Why me?" can also block compassion for yourself. When you believe something shouldn't have happened, you may judge yourself for not handling it better. "I should be stronger. I should be over this." This judgment adds another layer of suffering. Acceptance-based inquiry removes this judgment. It allows kindness. This is hard. Anyone would struggle. This kindness does not weaken you. It stabilizes you. There is also a temporal cost. "Why me?" keeps you stuck in the moment of impact. Acceptance-based inquiry moves you into the process of integration. You stop reliving the wound and start digesting it. Resistance-based questioning often seeks certainty, a final answer that will make everything make sense. But life does not offer such answers. The search becomes endless. Acceptance-based inquiry tolerates uncertainty. It does not demand closure before healing. Another hidden cost is the erosion of trust. When you believe life singled you out, you stop trusting existence. You brace for more attacks. This vigilance creates chronic stress. Acceptance-based inquiry rebuilds trust, not by promising safety, but by proving you can meet whatever arises. When inquiry comes from acceptance, it feels different. It is slower, softer. It does not rush to conclusions. It allows silence. In that silence, insight appears naturally. For example, instead of "Why did this happen to me?" acceptance-based inquiry might sound like, "What is this showing me about what matters?" Or, "What has this revealed about my attachments?" Or, "How has this changed me?" These questions do not argue with reality. They learn from it. Inquiry from acceptance also shifts responsibility. Not responsibility for causing the event, but responsibility for relating to it. You stop asking life to justify itself. You begin to respond wisely. Another difference is emotional tone. "Why me?" from resistance carries bitterness. Inquiry from acceptance carries curiosity. Curiosity does not deny pain. It makes pain workable. The mind often fears that letting go of "why me" means giving up meaning, but the opposite is true. Meaning does not come from explanations imposed on life. It comes from understanding gained through experience. Resistance-based questioning tries to extract meaning before understanding. Acceptance-based inquiry allows understanding to mature into meaning. There is also a relational cost. When you are stuck in "why me?" it can be hard to hear others. Their support may feel inadequate. Their words may irritate. Acceptance-based inquiry opens you to connection. You feel less alone. Another subtle cost is rigidity. The story of "why me?" hardens identity. You become fixed around the wound. Acceptance-based inquiry keeps identity fluid. You are not reduced to what happened to you. This does not mean you forget or minimize pain. It means pain does not become your center. When inquiry shifts from resistance to acceptance, something important happens. The question loses its edge. It no longer demands an answer. It becomes a doorway. You move from interrogation to exploration. Exploration allows discovery. You discover resilience you didn't know you had. You discover values clarified by loss. You discover depth created by hardship. These discoveries do not justify suffering, they redeem it. Another transformation is how you relate to fairness. Life is not fair. Acceptance does not pretend otherwise. It accepts this truth without bitterness. From this acceptance, compassion arises naturally. You stop expecting life to protect you. You start caring for yourself. Inquiry from acceptance also reveals shared humanity. You see that suffering is not a personal curse. It is a condition of being alive. This realization softens self-pity without invalidating pain. When you stop asking, "Why me?" from resistance, you stop placing yourself at the center of a cosmic narrative. This decentering reduces pressure. You are not being singled out. You are participating in life. This participation brings dignity. You meet experience as it comes, without demanding explanation. You stand with reality instead of against it. The spiritual cost of "why me?" is not the question itself. It is the posture behind it. When the posture shifts, the question transforms. Instead of "why me?" life becomes "what now?" Instead of accusation, there is engagement. Instead of bitterness, there is clarity. This shift does not erase grief. It changes your relationship to it. Grief becomes something you walk with, not something you fight. When "why me?" loosens and inquiry becomes honest instead of defensive, something else becomes painfully obvious. A large part of your suffering has not been coming from events at all. It has been coming from the conversation you keep having with yourself about those events. The endless debate, the constant closing argument, the mental courtroom that never adjourns. And the shocking truth is this: peace doesn't come from winning that argument. Peace comes from ending it. Most people live with an inner commentator that never stops. It argues with reality, argues with the past, argues with the future, argues with the body, argues with emotion. It says, "This shouldn't be happening. I shouldn't feel this. They shouldn't have done that. I should have known better." These sentences don't just describe experience, they fight it, and every fight adds friction. The mind believes these debates are productive. It thinks that if it can explain enough, analyze enough, justify enough, it will finally feel settled. But the debate is not designed to end. It is designed to keep identity and control in place. That's why it repeats. The mind doesn't seek truth in these arguments. It seeks relief through certainty. And certainty is rarely available. Inner argument is a form of resistance that pretends to be problem-solving. To see this clearly, notice what happens when you replay a painful moment. The mind doesn't simply remember. It relitigates. It corrects. It rewrites. It argues with what was. It tries to change the past by thinking harder. This is not reflection. It is an attempt to dominate reality through thought, and it always fails because thought cannot alter what already happened. The cost is enormous. The body tightens each time. The nervous system reacts as if the event is happening again. You relive, you re-feel, you rehearse. Suffering becomes chronic, not because life keeps hurting you, but because the mind keeps reopening the wound. Peace is not a conclusion. It is the absence of argument. This is where acceptance becomes revolutionary. Acceptance is not a new thought you add to the debate. It is the choice to stop debating. It is the moment you drop the need to be right about your pain, to justify your anger, to prove your worth, to control the narrative. When inner argument ends, something immediate happens. Energy returns. You feel it in the body first. A release, a softening, a longer exhale. The mind becomes quieter, not because you forced it, but because it no longer has fuel. Arguments need fuel. The fuel is resistance. Inner debates often take two forms. One is argument with reality. This shouldn't be happening. The other is argument with self. I shouldn't be like this. Both are violent in their own way. Both reject the present moment. Both create suffering. The mind thinks it must choose the correct side of the argument. Should I blame myself or blame them? Should I be kind to myself or push myself? Should I let go or hold on? These debates feel important, but often they are distractions from a simpler truth. The situation is already here. The feeling is already here. The body is already reacting. The debate changes none of it. Acceptance does not choose a side. It steps out of the ring. Stepping out does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop fighting what is already true. You stop treating reality like a negotiation. This creates space for actual action when action is needed, rather than mental noise. Inner argument also creates confusion because it multiplies perspectives. One part of you wants to rest. Another part calls you lazy. One part wants to speak honestly. Another part fears rejection. One part wants to leave. Another part fears loneliness. This internal conflict feels like complexity, but it's often fear pulling the mind in opposite directions. Acceptance doesn't solve the debate. It ends it by returning to what is true right now. What is true might be, I feel pain. I feel fear. I don't know what to do yet. These truths do not require debate. They require presence. When you state truth without argument, the mind stabilizes. It has something solid, reality. The internal debate often masks a deeper refusal, the refusal to feel. If you stay in argument, you stay in thought. Thought feels safer than raw sensation. Argument is a way to avoid contact with grief, fear, shame, or vulnerability. It keeps you busy. It keeps you away from the feeling that might actually heal if you allowed it. Acceptance ends argument by bringing you back to the body. When you feel the breath, the weight of the body, the texture of emotion, the argument weakens. It cannot survive direct presence for long because direct presence exposes its futility. You cannot argue with a sensation the same way you argue with a story. Sensation is immediate. It doesn't negotiate. Another reason peace doesn't come from winning internal debates is that the mind can always create a counter-argument. Even if you win, another voice appears. Yes, but still, what if this is endless? The mind is creative. It will always find another angle. Peace is not the victory of one voice over another. It is the silence that comes when you stop feeding the voices. Acceptance does this by removing the need for resolution. Many internal debates are attempts to resolve uncertainty. But some uncertainty cannot be resolved. You cannot know how everything will turn out. You cannot guarantee you won't be hurt again. You cannot make the past perfect. When you accept this, the debate loses its purpose. The mind argues because it wants certainty. Acceptance gives it something better, tolerance for uncertainty. Tolerance is not resignation, it's strength. It's the ability to stay present without needing life to explain itself. There is also the inner argument about meaning. What does this say about me? What does this mean about my life? Am I failing? These questions may feel deep, but they often become compulsive. They drag you into identity. Acceptance pulls you out of identity and into experience. Instead of, what does this say about me? The honest truth becomes, this is happening. That simplicity is peaceful. The mind resists simplicity because simplicity removes drama. But drama is not aliveness. Drama is agitation. When drama fades, you feel quiet. And quiet can feel unfamiliar, even scary, because the nervous system has become accustomed to tension. Acceptance trains you to tolerate quiet. It also trains you to tolerate unfinished stories. Many internal debates exist because you want a clean narrative, you want closure, you want the right explanation. But life is often messy. Stories don't always resolve neatly. Acceptance allows messiness without collapsing. This doesn't mean you never reflect or think. It means thinking is no longer compulsive. It becomes a tool used when needed, not a cage you live inside. One of the most powerful practices is learning to recognize the exact moment an inner argument begins. It often starts with a word like should. I should have. They should. This should. That word is the spark. When you notice it, you can pause and ask, is this a fact or a demand? Most of the time, it's a demand, and demands create conflict. Replacing demands with facts ends arguments. Facts are grounding, demands are agitating. Another way arguments persist is through self-attack. The mind believes self-attack creates improvement, but self-attack creates fear. Fear creates avoidance. Avoidance creates stagnation. Acceptance is more effective than self-attack because it creates safety. In safety, change becomes possible. Inner argument also steals intimacy. When you're in debate, you're not fully present with others. You're half in your head, half rehearsing, half defending. Acceptance returns you to the moment, making relationships more real. Acceptance ends argument not by suppressing thought, but by refusing to participate in pointless conflict. Thoughts can still arise, opinions can still appear, but you don't have to argue with them. You can let them pass like weather. This is a critical distinction. You are not trying to silence the mind. You are stopping the mind from turning experience into war. When inner argument ends, it doesn't mean everything feels good. It means everything feels honest. Pain can be there, fear can be there, but they are not multiplied by debate. This is why acceptance is so powerful. It removes the second layer of suffering, the resistance to what is. You meet life directly, without commentary, without litigation. And from that directness, action becomes clearer. Not frantic action, not action driven by proving yourself, but clean action that fits reality. When the inner arguments finally quiet and the need to win inside yourself dissolves, something unfamiliar takes their place. It isn't excitement. It isn't relief in the way the mind expects. It's a kind of openness that feels both spacious and unsettling, because in that openness, control no longer has a role, and without control, something deeper begins to speak. This is where acceptance reveals what force never could. Control has always promised safety. If you plan enough, fix enough, adjust enough, life will cooperate. That promise is seductive because it offers certainty in an uncertain world. But control only ever works on the surface. It rearranges appearances. It manages symptoms. It creates short-term order while quietly feeding long-term exhaustion. Acceptance teaches a different intelligence, one that does not come from effort but from alignment. When manipulation stops, reality becomes clearer, not kinder, not easier, clearer. You start to see how things actually function instead of how you wish they would. This clarity is uncomfortable at first because it removes illusion. But illusion always costs energy. Clarity returns it. Control tries to bend reality to match preference. Acceptance listens to reality to understand its direction. There is a deep intelligence in life that cannot be accessed through force. It only reveals itself when you stop interfering. Much like water that becomes clear when left undisturbed, the mind reveals insight when it is not constantly stirred by fixing and forcing. Control believes problems are enemies. Acceptance sees problems as information. When you try to control an experience, you narrow perception. You focus on one outcome, one solution, one version of how things should be. This narrowing blinds you to alternatives. Acceptance widens perception. You see more variables, more options, more nuance. Solutions appear that control could never imagine. Control operates from fear, fear of loss, fear of failure, fear of uncertainty. Acceptance operates from trust, not blind trust, but trust in the capacity to respond. Trust that you don't need to dominate life to participate in it. This trust changes everything. When you stop forcing change, you begin to notice timing. Control ignores timing. It pushes regardless of readiness. Acceptance respects timing. It senses when action will land and when it will create resistance. This sensitivity is not passive, it is intelligent. Acceptance teaches you when to act and when to wait. Control creates urgency. Acceptance creates discernment. Another intelligence revealed by acceptance is the difference between effort and strain. Effort is clean. It feels directed. Strain feels tight and desperate. Control often confuses strain for effort. Acceptance distinguishes them. When strain appears, acceptance pauses. This pause prevents harm. Control often leads to burnout because it ignores limits. Acceptance teaches respect for limits, not as weakness, but as wisdom. Knowing when to stop is as important as knowing when to act. Acceptance also reveals the intelligence of the body. Control often treats the body like a machine to be overridden. Push through, ignore signals, optimize output. Acceptance listens to the body as a source of information. Fatigue becomes guidance, pain becomes instruction, pleasure becomes signal. This listening prevents collapse. Control thinks more input will fix everything. More thinking, more strategy, more effort. Acceptance reveals that less interference often brings better results. Space allows integration. Silence allows clarity. This is especially true emotionally. When you try to control emotions, they intensify. When you allow them, they move. Acceptance teaches emotional regulation not through suppression, but through understanding. Control wants predictability. Acceptance teaches adaptability. Life is not predictable, but it is responsive. When you stop trying to lock it into certainty, you become more responsive yourself. You adjust faster. You recover quicker. You learn sooner. Acceptance also reveals the intelligence of uncertainty. Control treats uncertainty as a problem. Acceptance treats it as an opening. When you don't know, you're available. Available to learn. Available to change. Available to notice what you would miss if you were certain. Certainty closes. Uncertainty opens. Control often blocks intimacy. When you try to manage how others see you, you remain guarded. Acceptance allows authenticity. You show up as you are. This vulnerability deepens connection. People respond to honesty more than performance. Acceptance also teaches the intelligence of limits in relationships. Control tries to change people. Acceptance sees people clearly. This clarity allows you to choose wisely, to engage where there is mutuality, to step back where there is harm. Control entangles, acceptance clarifies. Another intelligence revealed by acceptance is how little effort is needed when resistance ends. Many struggles are maintained by opposition. When opposition stops, movement becomes natural. Decisions become simpler. Actions become lighter. Control creates friction. Acceptance reduces it. Acceptance also reveals the intelligence of letting consequences teach. Control tries to prevent all discomfort. Acceptance allows natural consequences to instruct. This does not mean reckless behavior. It means allowing reality to give feedback instead of constantly intervening. Control often delays learning. Acceptance accelerates it. When you stop fixing, you begin to see patterns clearly, not as problems, but as information. You recognize cycles. You understand cause and effect. This understanding arises naturally, without analysis, when you stop interfering. Acceptance also reveals the intelligence of rest. Control sees rest as wasted time. Acceptance sees rest as integration. During rest, the mind processes, the body repairs, insight consolidates. Without rest, nothing integrates. Control keeps you busy. Acceptance makes you effective. Another teaching acceptance offers is humility. Control inflates the sense of authorship. I make things happen. Acceptance reveals interdependence. How many conditions contribute to every outcome? This humility reduces self-blame and arrogance alike. You stop taking full credit and full blame for things that were never fully yours. Acceptance also teaches gratitude without forcing it. Control tries to manufacture positivity. Acceptance allows appreciation to arise naturally. When you see life clearly, gratitude appears on its own, without effort. Control is loud, acceptance is quiet. And in that quiet, subtleties emerge. You start to notice small signals, shifts in energy, changes in mood, early signs of misalignment. Control misses these because it's focused on outcome. Acceptance notices them because it's present. Acceptance also teaches the intelligence of non-attachment. You still care, you still engage, but you don't grip. This reduces fear of loss. You participate fully without trying to own outcomes. Control tightens attachment. Acceptance loosens it. Another insight acceptance reveals is that many problems solve themselves when you stop fighting them. Not because they disappear, but because your relationship changes. What felt unbearable becomes workable. What felt urgent becomes manageable. Acceptance also exposes false problems, issues created by expectation rather than reality. Control spends energy fixing these imaginary problems. Acceptance dissolves them by seeing they were never real. Control often confuses motion with progress. Acceptance reveals that stillness can be progress. Sometimes the most effective move is not moving. Acceptance teaches the intelligence of presence. When you are fully present, you respond accurately. Control often operates from projection. It reacts to imagined futures and remembered pasts. Acceptance stays with what is actually happening. This presence sharpens intuition, not mystical intuition, but practical knowing. You sense when something is off, when something is right. This sensing guides action more reliably than strategy alone. Acceptance also teaches the intelligence of simplicity. Control complicates. Acceptance simplifies. You stop adding layers. You deal with what's in front of you. This reduces overwhelm. Another difference is how mistakes are handled. Control reacts with shame or correction. Acceptance treats mistakes as information. This learning mindset prevents repeated errors. Acceptance also reveals that forcing change often strengthens resistance. When you push yourself too hard, the mind rebels. Acceptance works with the mind, not against it. Change becomes cooperative. Control tries to dominate life. Acceptance collaborates with it. This collaboration does not mean surrendering agency. It means using agency wisely. You act where action helps. You let go where letting go helps. This balance is intelligence. Acceptance also teaches that peace is not the absence of challenge. It is the absence of unnecessary struggle. Control adds struggle. Acceptance removes it. When manipulation stops, you feel more alive. Not because life is perfect, but because energy is no longer wasted on fighting reality. Acceptance teaches you that life has its own momentum. When you align with it, things flow more smoothly. When you resist it, friction increases. This doesn't mean life becomes predictable. It means you become adaptable. When control finally loosens and acceptance replaces force, something very quiet happens inside. It's not dramatic. There's no breakthrough moment, no sudden relief. Instead, the struggle fades. The inner push and pull ends. And in that stillness, the mind begins to see. Not better, not happier, but clearer. This is the moment the mind stops fighting and starts seeing, and nothing looks the same afterward. For most of life, perception is distorted by resistance. You don't see what is. You see what you want, what you fear, what you expect, or what you're trying to avoid. Every experience passes through layers of judgment and reaction before it reaches awareness. The moment resistance dissolves, those layers fall away. What remains is direct perception. This is not enlightenment in the dramatic sense, it's sobriety, reality without intoxication. When the mind stops fighting, it stops interpreting everything as a problem. It stops labeling each sensation as good or bad before it is fully known. It stops narrating experience in a way that keeps identity intact. Seeing replaces storytelling. At first, this can feel strange, even disappointing. You may expect peace to feel warm or comforting, but clarity often feels neutral, clean, undeniable. Reality becomes simpler, but not easier. The difficulty is still there. The pain still exists. The uncertainty still remains. But the confusion around them disappears. Confusion is what resistance creates. Clarity is what acceptance reveals. When resistance dissolves, perception sharpens because attention is no longer split. Before, part of the mind was fighting, another part was defending, another part was planning escape. Now attention gathers. It rests in what is happening. This unified attention sees details that were always present but never noticed. You begin to notice subtle sensations in the body, microtensions softening, the exact texture of emotion, the difference between fear and anticipation, between sadness and fatigue. These distinctions matter because they change how you respond. When perception sharpens, reaction slows. You no longer confuse sensation with threat. A tight chest is no longer immediately interpreted as danger. A heavy mood is no longer treated as failure. Seeing breaks automatic reaction. The mind also stops projecting as much. Before, you were often seeing the future through fear or hope, or the present through memory. When resistance ends, projection weakens. You see what is in front of you, not what you think it means. This doesn't make life easier. In fact, it can make certain truths harder to avoid. You see clearly when something is ending. You see when effort is no longer aligned. You see when a relationship is unhealthy. You see when you are exhausted. Clarity removes comforting illusions, but clarity also removes unnecessary suffering. When perception sharpens, you notice how much pain was being added by thought. Not pain itself, but commentary. The "this shouldn't be happening," the "what if this never ends," the "why am I like this?" When these thoughts fall away, experience becomes more manageable, even if it remains difficult. Seeing also reveals that many struggles were never about the situation. They were about resistance to the situation. The mind was fighting a version of reality that no longer existed or never did. Once the fight ends, energy returns. Another change is how you experience time. When resistance is present, time feels heavy or rushed. You want the moment to end, or you want to get somewhere else. When resistance dissolves, time becomes neutral. Moments unfold without pressure. You are no longer pushing the present away or pulling the future toward you. This changes how patience feels. It's no longer an effort, it's simply the absence of urgency. Perception also becomes more accurate emotionally. You stop exaggerating, you stop minimizing, you feel what you feel without turning it into identity. Sadness is sadness, fear is fear. They are no longer evidence of failure or signs of regression. They are states passing through awareness. When the mind stops fighting, it stops defending self-image. This is crucial. Defense distorts perception. You see criticism as attack. You see feedback as threat. You see uncertainty as danger. Without defense, you see information instead of insult. This makes learning possible. Seeing clearly also reveals cause and effect more honestly. You notice how certain thoughts lead to tension, how certain habits lead to fatigue, how certain boundaries restore energy. This understanding doesn't come from analysis. It comes from observation without interference. Reality becomes simpler because you stop adding layers. You stop making everything about you, about your worth, about your story, about your future. Things are allowed to be what they are. Simple does not mean pleasant. It means direct. When perception sharpens, you also notice how little control you actually have. This is not discouraging. It's freeing. You stop trying to manage what cannot be managed. You focus on what you can actually respond to. This reduces anxiety. You also notice how rarely life demands a dramatic response. Most moments require simple presence, listening, resting, speaking honestly, letting go. Resistance made everything feel urgent. Seeing reveals that urgency was mostly imagined. Another shift happens in how you experience other people. When resistance dissolves, you stop seeing others through your projections. You see their behavior more clearly without personalizing everything. This doesn't mean you excuse harm. It means you respond appropriately instead of reactively. You also become more aware of your own motivations. You notice when actions come from fear instead of clarity, from obligation instead of choice. This awareness allows adjustment without self-attack. Seeing also simplifies decision-making. When you are no longer fighting reality, decisions are based on what is actually happening, not what you wish were happening. This may lead to difficult choices, but they are cleaner. Less regret, less confusion. Perception sharpens in the body as well. You notice when you are tired before collapse, when you are tense before pain, when you are overwhelmed before shutdown. This early awareness allows care instead of damage. When the mind stops fighting, it also stops fantasizing as much. Fantasy is often a refuge from discomfort. Seeing brings you back to the present, which can feel less exciting but more real. Over time, this reality becomes rich in a quieter way. You begin to notice small things: sounds, light, movement, breath. These were always there, but resistance pulled attention away. Seeing returns attention to life as it is lived. Another important change is how mistakes are perceived. Without resistance, mistakes are no longer personal failures. They are information. You adjust without shame. This makes growth continuous rather than episodic. Seeing also reveals how much suffering came from expectations. Expectations about how fast you should heal, how others should behave, how life should unfold. When these expectations dissolve, reality becomes more workable. This does not mean you have no preferences. It means preferences no longer dictate your emotional state. When perception sharpens, you also become aware of subtle joy, not excitement, not pleasure, but a sense of okayness that exists even alongside pain. This joy is not dependent on circumstances. It arises from alignment with reality. Reality becomes simpler because you stop asking it to be something else. Seeing also makes grief cleaner. When loss occurs, you feel it fully without resistance. The pain is sharp, but it is not prolonged by denial. Grief moves through rather than getting stuck. You also become more honest with yourself and others. Without defense, there is less need to lie or perform. Honesty simplifies relationships. You say less, but mean more. The mind stopping its fight also reveals a deeper intelligence at work. Not personal intelligence, not strategic intelligence, but the intelligence of awareness itself, the ability to know what is happening without distortion. This intelligence does not solve all problems. It changes how problems are met. You stop escalating them mentally. You meet them proportionally. Seeing also removes a sense of victimhood, not by denying harm, but by removing the belief that life is happening to you personally. Life is happening. You are part of it. This perspective reduces bitterness. Another effect is reduced mental noise. Thoughts still arise, but they are not sticky. You don't chase them. You don't wrestle with them. They pass. Silence increases naturally. In that silence, perception becomes more refined. You notice intention before action, emotion before reaction. This gives you choice. Reality becomes simpler because it is no longer filtered through constant interpretation. This simplicity does not make life painless, it makes it navigable. When the mind stops fighting, it also stops seeking constant reassurance. You don't need life to prove anything, you don't need guarantees. You meet what comes. This meeting creates confidence, not bravado, quiet confidence. The confidence that comes from knowing you can see clearly and respond. Seeing also changes how you experience uncertainty. It becomes less threatening. You stop filling unknowns with fear. You let them be unknown. This reduces anxiety dramatically. The moment the mind stops fighting is the moment you realize how much energy fighting was consuming. Without that drain, you feel more alive, more present, more capable. Reality doesn't become easier. Pain still hurts, loss still hurts, change still destabilizes, but reality becomes simpler because you are no longer complicating it. This simplicity is the ground for deeper learning. When perception is clear, learning accelerates, not through discipline, but through openness. And that openness is the doorway to the next understanding, where the mind discovers it learns fastest, not when it defends itself, but when it stops protecting an image and allows truth to enter freely. When perception becomes clear and the mind stops fighting what is, another shift quietly unfolds. You start to notice how different learning feels. It's no longer heavy, no longer forced, no longer something you have to discipline yourself into. Understanding begins to arrive faster, more naturally, almost on its own. And the reason is simple. The mind is no longer defending itself. Defense slows learning. Openness accelerates it. Most people believe growth requires pressure, effort, willpower, pushing through resistance. They believe the mind learns the same way muscles grow, by strain and repetition. But inner learning does not work like physical training. The mind does not open through force. It opens through safety. And defense is the opposite of safety. When the mind is defending itself, it is not curious. It is protecting an image, a story, a position. It is busy maintaining identity. And a mind that is busy protecting cannot learn efficiently because learning threatens what it already believes. Defense says, I already know. Openness says, let me see. The moment the mind stops defending, it becomes receptive. Receptivity is not weakness. It is intelligence without armor. And intelligence without armor learns quickly because it does not have to filter everything through fear. Defense shows up in many forms: justification, over-explaining, blaming, minimizing, comparing, proving. These are not neutral habits, they are shields. Each one blocks information that could lead to insight. For example, when something painful happens and the mind immediately explains why it's not a big deal, learning stops. When the mind blames someone else, learning stops. When the mind turns inward and attacks itself, learning stops. In each case, defense has replaced curiosity. Openness feels different. It doesn't rush to interpret, it pauses. It allows experience to register fully. This pause is where learning happens. The mind learns fastest when it is not trying to be right. Being right protects identity. Learning dissolves it. This is why discipline and willpower have limits. They can force behavior temporarily, but they cannot force understanding. You can discipline yourself to meditate, but you cannot discipline yourself into insight. Insight arises when conditions are right. And the most important condition is openness. Openness means allowing the possibility that your current view is incomplete, that your reaction might not tell the whole story, that your assumptions might be outdated. This allowance creates mental flexibility. Flexibility accelerates learning. A defensive mind is rigid. A receptive mind is adaptive. When the mind is defending, it interprets feedback as threat. Criticism feels like attack. Failure feels like humiliation. Uncertainty feels dangerous. In this state, the nervous system is activated. Stress hormones rise, attention narrows, learning capacity drops. When defense drops, the nervous system relaxes, attention widens, information flows more freely. You see patterns instead of isolated events. You notice nuance. You integrate faster. This is not theory, it is observable. Think about moments when you truly learned something meaningful. They rarely came from pressure. They came from moments of honesty, of vulnerability, of openness to being wrong. The mind learns when it feels safe enough to admit, "I don't know." Defense hates that sentence. It feels like collapse. But in reality, "I don't know" is the doorway to insight. Another reason openness accelerates learning is that it allows emotion to be processed instead of suppressed. Suppressed emotion occupies mental space. It drains attention. When emotion is allowed, it completes itself. This frees cognitive resources for understanding. A defended mind is crowded. An open mind is spacious. Defense also fragments attention. Part of the mind monitors how it appears. Another part scans for threat. Another part rehearses explanations. Learning requires unified attention. Openness brings attention back together. This is why presence is so powerful. When you are present, you are not defending. You are receiving, and receiving is how learning happens. Willpower often tries to override resistance. Openness listens to it. Listening reveals information that willpower ignores, and information is what leads to insight. When the mind stops defending, it also stops rushing. Defense creates urgency. Fix this now. Prove this. Resolve this. Urgency narrows perception. Openness allows time. Time allows complexity to be seen. Learning deepens when the mind is not in a hurry. Another key difference is how mistakes are treated. A defended mind treats mistakes as evidence of failure. It hides them, rationalizes them, or attacks itself over them. An open mind treats mistakes as data. It studies them without shame. This leads to rapid adjustment. Shame is one of the greatest learning inhibitors. Openness dissolves shame by replacing judgment with curiosity. The mind also learns faster when it is not defending an identity. When you are attached to being a certain kind of person, learning that contradicts that image feels threatening. You resist it. When identity loosens, learning flows freely. This is why beginners often learn faster than experts. Beginners have less to defend. They are open. Experts sometimes cling to what they know. This clinging slows learning. Openness returns you to beginner's mind. Another aspect is how the mind relates to discomfort. Defense tries to eliminate discomfort quickly. Openness allows discomfort long enough to understand it. This understanding prevents repetition. You learn once instead of suffering repeatedly. A defended mind avoids discomfort. An open mind learns from it. Defense also creates selective perception. You only notice information that supports your existing beliefs. Contradictory information is dismissed. Openness allows all information in. This creates a more accurate understanding of reality. Accuracy matters. You cannot learn effectively from a distorted view. When openness replaces defense, the mind becomes more honest. It sees what is actually happening instead of what it wishes were happening. Honesty accelerates learning because it removes confusion. Defense confuses. Openness clarifies. Another reason learning speeds up is that openness allows integration. Insights are not isolated. They connect to other experiences. They change behavior organically. You don't have to remember to apply them. They become part of how you see. This integration is what makes learning durable. Willpower can create temporary change. Openness creates permanent change. Defense also drains energy. Maintaining a position requires effort. Openness relaxes effort. That energy becomes available for perception. You notice more because you are not busy holding a stance. Learning thrives in relaxed attention. There is also a difference in emotional tone. Defense is tense. Openness is calm. Calm does not mean passive. It means clear. Clarity is fertile ground for insight. When the mind is calm, it can hold complexity. It can see multiple factors at once. It can tolerate ambiguity. This allows deeper understanding. Defense simplifies reality in the wrong way. It reduces everything to threat or safety. Openness simplifies reality in the right way. It removes unnecessary layers and sees what matters. Another shift is how the mind responds to uncertainty. Defense treats uncertainty as danger. Openness treats it as space. Space allows learning to unfold. Many insights arise not because you found the answer, but because you stopped insisting on one. Defense also interferes with memory. When you are defensive, you remember selectively. Openness allows memory to reorganize. Past experiences are reinterpreted in light of new understanding. This is learning at depth. Openness also changes how you listen to others. You are no longer listening to respond or defend. You are listening to understand. This expands perspective. Learning becomes relational instead of isolated. Defense creates walls. Openness creates bridges. Another important factor is humility. Openness requires humility, not humiliation. Humility is realism about your limits. This realism keeps the mind flexible. Flexibility is essential for learning. A defended mind resists feedback. An open mind welcomes it, even when it stings. This does not mean believing everything you hear. It means considering it honestly before rejecting or accepting. That consideration is where learning happens. Openness also accelerates learning because it allows rest. A tired mind learns poorly. Defense is exhausting. Openness reduces inattention. Rest restores learning capacity. There is also a biological aspect. When defense drops, the body shifts out of fight or flight. Blood flow returns to areas of the brain responsible for integration and insight. This is not metaphorical. It is physiological. Openness literally changes how the brain functions. Discipline can keep you going when motivation is low, but it cannot create insight. Insight arises when the mind feels safe enough to relax into truth. Defense is fear-based. Openness is curiosity-based. Curiosity is one of the fastest learning accelerators. It keeps attention engaged without tension. It invites exploration instead of forcing answers. When curiosity replaces defense, questions change. Instead of, how do I get rid of this? The question becomes, what is this showing me? That shift alone transforms suffering into learning. Openness also shortens learning cycles. Instead of repeating the same lesson through pain, you learn it once through awareness. This saves time and energy. Defense delays learning by turning lessons into battles. When the mind stops defending, it also stops needing to be perfect. Perfectionism is a form of defense. It prevents experimentation. Openness allows trial and error. Error is essential to learning. Another shift is how you relate to success. A defended mind clings to success and fears losing it. An open mind